Hey guys, find somewhere soft. Let the weight of the day leave your shoulders. Whatever you are carrying, you can set it down now. Nothing here needs your attention. Nothing here moves fast. Tonight, I want to take you inside the private rooms of an empress. Not the throne room, not the ballroom. The small curtained rooms where she spent most of her waking hours, alone with her hair, her mirrors, and the one woman she trusted to touch her. We're going to follow the rituals she built around her own body, one by one, from the cold water before dawn to the last pin pulled from her hair at the end of the night. It's a slow story, full of small, strange details, and it's meant to carry you towards sleep. If these quiet evenings help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe to the channel, so another night like this one finds you when you need it. A like, or a few words about where you're listening from, helps someone else find their way here too. But none of that matters now. It can wait until morning. It can wait forever. Let the room around you go dark. Let your breathing find its own pace. And when you're ready, we'll step through a heavy door into a room where the curtains are still drawn, and the only light is a single candle burning on a dressing table. Vienna, sometime in the 1860s. It's not yet 6 in the morning, and the Hofburg is still dark. Most of the palace is asleep. The ministers, the guards, the long corridors full of portraits that no one looks at anymore. But in a small room on the upper floor, behind curtains so heavy they swallow the sound of the street below, a candle's already burning. There's water in a basin. It's cold, and a woman is about to step into it. She's 27, maybe 28. Tall, taller than her husband, though the court painters always fix that. Thin in a way that makes people uneasy when they stand close to her. Her hair isn't braided yet. It's loose, all of it, falling around her like something alive, dark and heavy and long enough to pool on the stone floor behind her bare feet. In a few minutes someone will knock. A woman in a black dress with a white lace apron will come in carrying combs and pins on a silver tray, and for the next 3 hours nobody else in the empire will exist. That's where we're going tonight. Into that room. Into the strange, quiet hours that made up most of this woman's life. Not the audiences, not the state dinners, not the things you'd expect from an Empress of Austria. The other hours, the ones she gave to her own body, we'll watch the whole slow ceremony of it. The oils, the creams, the raw meat pressed against her skin while she slept. The leather undergarments so thin you could read through them. The corset pulled tighter and tighter until her waist measured no more than a woman's handspan. And afterward, being stitched, actually sewn, into whatever she'd wear that day, because buttons and hooks weren't close enough to the body for her. If you'd been standing in that room, you'd have noticed how quiet it was, how careful. Every movement had a purpose. Every jar on the dressing table had its place. And somewhere in the middle of all this silence, you'd have started to feel something odd. That this wasn't vanity exactly. It was closer to the way a craftsman runs a hand along a finished edge. Something built. Something held together by discipline and repetition, and an extraordinary stubbornness that the rest of the court couldn't quite explain and couldn't look away from. Tonight, we don't need to explain it either. We're just going to be there. Close enough to smell the cognac and the egg yolk in her hair. Close enough to hear the teeth of the comb, and it begins here, in this room, with the water still cold in the basin and the candle not yet burned down to half. In the summer of 1853, a 15-year-old girl from the Bavarian countryside stepped into the most powerful family in Europe, and nobody thought she was especially pretty. Her name was Elisabeth, and her own mother, Duchess Ludovica, had written to relatives not long before trying to arrange a marriage for her in Saxony, admitting with a kind of tired honesty that the girl was fresh-faced enough, but had, and this is what she actually said, not a single attractive feature. Not one. The Saxon prince didn't want her. She came home without a proposal, and nobody was surprised. She was a thin, half-grown thing with long, dark blonde braids and slightly melancholy eyes. She could ride, swim, fish, climb mountains. She spoke Bavarian dialect and had good friends among the farm children near her family's summer house at Possenhofen, on the shore of Lake Starnberg. Her manners were rough. Her education was patchy. She knew almost nothing about court life, and cared even less. Her father, Duke Max, was a free-spirited man who played the zither on top of the Cheops pyramid and kept a private circus in the courtyard of his Munich palace, complete with box seats and stalls where Munich society watched him perform riding stunts alongside pantomimes and clowns. He ate lunch every day not with his 8 legitimate children, but alone with his 2 illegitimate daughters, whom he loved best. At midday he was never to be disturbed. not by his wife, and certainly not by his children. He wore his democratic opinions like a costume, shocking everyone around him on purpose. But if anyone presumed too far with him in return, there was, as a relative put it, all hell to pay. That was the house she grew up in, loud, warm in its own disordered way, full of dogs and music and half-written poems and the faint smell of a horse drifting up from the courtyard circus below. And here's the thing that gets me about the Ischl story. She wasn't supposed to be there at all. Not really. The whole trip to the Emperor's summer retreat in the mountains was arranged for her older sister, Helene. Helene was the one their mother and their powerful aunt, Archduchess Sophie, had chosen for Emperor Franz Joseph. Helene was more beautiful, better educated, more serious, more suitable in every way. Elisabeth was only brought along as an afterthought, partly to distract her from a broken heart over a young count who'd recently fallen ill and passed away, and partly in the vague hope that she might catch the eye of the Emperor's younger brother, Karl Ludwig, with whom she'd been exchanging little gifts and letters for years. They arrived late, exhausted, still in black mourning clothes because a relative had recently passed. Duchess Ludovica had been forced to stop along the way because of a migraine, throwing off the whole carefully choreographed schedule. They came without luggage, without hairdressers, without a change of clothes. 3 women in dusty black travelling dresses stepping out into the mountain air of Ischl, where everything had been arranged to present one of them as a future empress. Archduchess Sophie sent a lady's maid to the hotel to help them get ready, and all the careful attention went to Helene, fixing her hair, smoothing her dress, making sure she looked her best despite the dust and the wrinkled black. Meanwhile, the 15-year-old did her own hair, simple long braids, nothing more. She didn't notice anyone watching, but Sophie was watching. She wrote to her sister Marie in Saxony afterward, describing the way the girl moved, the grace of it, the naturalness, how completely unaware she was of the impression she'd made. And then they went to tea, and the Emperor saw her. His younger brother, Karl Ludwig, watching from across the room, saw it happen. The way Franz Joseph's whole face changed when he looked at her. That expression of deep satisfaction, he told his mother later. There was no mistaking it. She didn't eat. She was too nervous. She whispered to the lady's maid that her older sister was lucky because Helene had already met so many people and knew how to be around them. She didn't even realise the Emperor was paying attention to her and not to Helene. She was 15 years old, and the most powerful man in Central Europe had just fallen in love with her, and she had no idea. The next morning Franz Joseph appeared in his mother's rooms before she'd even finished dressing, and told her he found Elisabeth enchanting. He compared her skin to a splitting almond. He said her lips were like strawberries. Sophie tried to redirect him to Helene. Wasn't Helene elegant? Wasn't she clever? But he couldn't stop talking about the younger one. He even refused to go hunting that day, which was something he never ever did. I keep thinking about what that must have been like for Helene, standing there in the same room, in her carefully chosen white silk dress with ivy woven across her forehead, watching the Emperor dance with her little sister instead. Watching the whole plan collapse. She'd been raised for this. She'd been groomed and prepared and told this was her future. And now it was gone. Taken by a girl in a simple pink dress who didn't even know how to waltz without a dancing master. At the ball that evening, the Emperor gave Elisabeth his bouquet after the cotillion, a traditional sign, understood by everyone present, that she was his chosen one. Everyone except her. When someone asked if she'd noticed the gesture, she said no, it had only embarrassed her. And when her mother finally told her what was happening, that the Emperor wanted to marry her, she burst into tears and said she'd do everything she could to make him happy. But then she added, almost to herself, "How can he be thinking of me? I'm so insignificant." And a moment later, "I do love the Emperor. If only he weren't an emperor." They were engaged the next day. She was 15, he was 23, and nobody, not her mother, not Sophie, not the court ladies who would soon surround her, thought of her as beautiful. Not yet. The beauty came later. It came slowly, and it came from a direction nobody expected. In the first years of her marriage, she was sickly, desperately unhappy, completely out of place in the rigid formality of the Viennese court. She barely ate. She was painfully thin, often in tears, and so unsure of herself on the polished floors and under the crystal chandeliers that she could barely speak above a whisper. Her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, took the babies away almost as soon as they were born, moved them into her own apartments, chose their names, chose their wet nurses, and left the young empress with empty arms and no say in the matter. The aristocratic women around her, the countesses and baronesses who ran Viennese society, weren't inclined to be generous. They picked apart her appearance, her clothes, her accent, her awkward French. In 1857, they crowned someone else, Charlotte, the bride of Archduke Maximilian, as the official beauty of the court. It was a deliberate slight, and Elisabeth felt it. But something was happening to her body. Quietly, without anyone planning it, she was changing. 3 pregnancies in her first 4 years of marriage had softened her figure. She grew taller, reaching a remarkable 172 centimetres, which made her taller than her husband by several centimetres, though the court painters always quietly adjusted this in their portraits, making the emperor bigger and the empress smaller. Her weight stayed at around 50 kilograms for the rest of her life. She saw to that. Constant movement and her refusal to eat more than a few spoonfuls of broth kept her extraordinarily slim, her waist holding at a barely credible 50 centimetres. And somewhere in those painful early years, the round-faced Bavarian farm girl disappeared, and in her place stood something the Viennese court wasn't quite prepared for. It was the ordinary people who noticed first. When she rode in the Prater, Vienna's great public park, crowds gathered just to see her. Archduchess Sophie wrote in her diary, sounding a little puzzled, "It's the Empress who draws them all. She is their joy, their idol." Whenever Elisabeth appeared on the streets, people surged toward her carriage and blocked the roads. Once, when she tried to visit St. Stephen's Cathedral on foot, so many people pressed around her that she panicked, started crying, and had to be helped into the sacristy to escape. Sophie called it almost a scandal. There's something tender about this part of the story if you sit with it. The court ladies didn't want to see it. The aristocrats who'd chosen Charlotte over her, who'd mocked her Bavarian manners and her quiet voice, they weren't ready to admit they were wrong. But the bakers and the shop girls and the people leaning out of windows along the Ringstrasse, they saw it before anyone else did. They didn't care about her lineage or her French pronunciation, or whether her dress was the right shade for the season. They just looked at her, and they knew. And I think there's something worth noticing in that. The way beauty, real beauty, doesn't always get recognised first by the people who are supposed to be experts. It gets recognised by the people who aren't trying to see anything in particular. The ones just standing there, on a street corner, watching a carriage go by. Even the police minister noticed. He wrote in his private diary that the Empress's beauty was drawing people to court functions who'd never bothered to come before. People who normally had no interest in the Emperor's receptions suddenly showing up because they'd heard what she looked like, and then the diplomats started noticing. The Prussian Crown Princess Victoria wrote to her mother, Queen Victoria, that she'd never seen anything so dazzling, and then added, almost reluctantly, that Elisabeth seemed to be laced terribly tight, which surely wasn't necessary with such a magnificent figure. Even the Prussian General Moltke, a man not known for sentiment, wrote to his wife after meeting Elisabeth that the rumours hadn't exaggerated. She was more captivating than beautiful, he said. Impossible to describe precisely. She spoke so softly you could barely hear her, and when she was finished talking to you, she made a graceful deep bow, and you understood you'd been dismissed. That softness of her voice. I want to stay with that for a moment, because it wasn't shyness exactly, or it was, but it was also something else. Her teeth were bad. They'd always been bad, and no dentist could fix them. She knew this, and it mortified her, and so when she spoke, she barely opened her lips. Her words came out as a whisper, almost inaudible, and people leaned in and still couldn't catch what she'd said. There's a story from around this time. The Prussian Crown Princess told it to Queen Victoria in a letter, about Elisabeth making polite conversation at a court reception, the kind of formal circle where the Empress was supposed to speak briefly to each guest. She asked a gentleman if he was married. He was hard of hearing and answered occasionally. She asked if he had children. He answered from time to time. And so the most famous beauty in Europe stood there with her lips barely parted, whispering questions into the chandelier light, while the people around her smiled and nodded and didn't understand a word. After a while she stopped trying. She kept her mouth closed, showed only the beauty and let the silence speak for her. But silence in a court like Vienna's doesn't stay empty for long. People filled it with their own meanings. They decided she was stupid. A beautiful fool, they called her. A lovely face with nothing behind it. And she felt it. She had that kind of nerve-ending sensitivity. the kind that picks up the temperature of a room before anyone said a word. She knew what they thought, and she pulled further back, further into herself, further from the world that wanted to look at her, but didn't want to listen. And yet, by the mid-1860s, there was no one left in Vienna who could compete with her. Not Charlotte, not any of the countesses, not Pauline Metternich with all her diamonds and her Paris connections. When Elisabeth appeared at her brother's wedding in Dresden in 1864, wearing a white dress embroidered with stars and great diamond stars woven into her hair, the Queen of Saxony wrote to a friend that she'd never seen her calm Saxon subjects so beside themselves. They could think of nothing else, talk of nothing else. The Empress's own brother-in-law, Archduke Ludwig Victor, wrote back to Vienna that she was blindingly beautiful, and the people were like madmen. He'd never seen anyone make such an impression. Her sister Aline was there too, wearing a similar star-embroidered dress. But Ludwig Victor dismissed her as a very poor imitation. At the wedding itself, it wasn't the bride who drew every eye. It was Elisabeth, this time in a lilac gown stitched with silver clovers, a diamond crown set into her elaborately braided hair, a silver lace mantle trailing behind her. The American minister in Vienna wrote home to his mother that the Empress was a wonder of beauty. Tall and slender, wonderfully formed, with a crown of light brown hair, a low Greek forehead, soft eyes, very red lips with a sweet smile. And then, a year later, sitting next to her at dinner, he watched her accidentally knock over a glass of punch and blush like a schoolgirl, and he was so charmed he wished he were a poet so he could write sonnets about her eyebrows. An overturned glass of punch, a blush, a whisper so quiet nobody could hear it. And somehow, out of all that awkwardness and self-doubt and silence, a woman the whole world wanted to see. It was around this time that the painter Winterhalter made the three famous portraits: Elisabeth with her hair loose, Elisabeth in a ball gown with those diamond stars, Elisabeth in a pose of quiet, almost otherworldly stillness. Reproduction spread across Europe and crossed the Atlantic. And suddenly, meeting her in person became its own kind of event. People came back from Vienna with stories the way people come back from seeing a comet. Her Hofdame, her lady-in-waiting, the Countess Marie Festetics, who knew her and loved her better than almost anyone, wrote in her diary that she never got tired of looking at her. Walking beside her was a pleasure. Walking behind her was a pleasure. She was a lily, then a swan, then a fairy. No, an elf. And then, at the end of it all, an empress, from the crown of her head to the soles of her shoes. But even then, at 34, Festetics noticed something missing. There was no joy in her. A stillness lay over her that was startling in someone so young. That's where we're starting tonight. Not with the beauty rituals, I will get to those. Not with the 3-hour hair, the raw meat masks, the gymnastic rings. All of that came later, came as a response to what she discovered about herself and what it meant. We're starting here, with the girl who arrived in a dusty black dress and did her own braids while nobody watched. Because I think something important happened in between, in that slow transformation from the girl nobody called beautiful to the woman an entire empire couldn't stop looking at. Something shifted, and the rituals that followed, the discipline, the obsession, the strange and elaborate machine she built around her own body. None of it makes sense unless you understand what came before. She was standing at a mirror in a palace full of people who'd decided she was nothing, and then, slowly, one face at a time, they changed their minds. The question is what that did to her. What it costs a person to be remade by other people's eyes. What it does to you when the world decides your body is the most interesting thing about you, and you can't quite disagree. But that's for later. For now, the candle's still burning, the braids are still simple, and the girl in the dusty black dress doesn't know yet what she's about to become. Every morning before she saw anyone, before she read a letter, before she spoke to her husband or kissed her youngest daughter, there was the hair. 3 hours of it, sometimes longer, and it began the same way every time, with the sound of a knock at the door of her private rooms, and a woman in a black dress with a white lace apron stepping inside, carrying combs and pins and a kind of silence that belonged only to this part of the day. In winter, the room was cold and half dark, the heavy curtains still drawn, a single candle on the dressing table. In summer, the light came in early and lay across the floor in long pale strips, while the rest of the Hofburg still slept. Either way, the ritual didn't change. It had its own season, its own weather, independent of everything happening outside those walls. The Empress sat in a chair by the window, wrapped in a white dressing gown made of something close to lace, her shoulders covered, her face bare. And then the hair came down. All of it. It had darkened over the years from the pale blonde of her girlhood to a deep chestnut brown, and it fell. Not to her shoulders, not to her waist, but all the way to the floor, past her knees, past her calves, past her bare heels, pooling on the cold stone behind the chair like something spilled. When she stood and let it hang free, it fell around her body like a curtain, like a cloak. She could disappear inside it. And sometimes, I think, that was exactly the point. The woman behind her, we'll talk about her properly in the next part of this story, would begin by running her hands through the full length of it, lifting it, letting it fall, feeling for tangles, then the combing, slowly, section by section, from the ends upward, working through the weight of it with long, careful strokes. Every hair that came loose in the comb was noted. Every strand that fell was accounted for. And this wasn't a figure of speech. It was literal. After the combing, the hairdresser would present the fallen hairs to the Empress on a small silver tray, and for a moment the two women's eyes would meet over that little pile of evidence, a look of quiet reproach from the Empress, a look of guilt, almost of apology, from the woman who'd been holding the comb. I keep coming back to that silver tray. There's something about it that won't let me go. Imagine the care it took, not just the combing itself, but the performance of the combing, the ritual, the way every lost hair was collected and displayed, as if the Empress's body was an accounting ledger, and each strand had to be entered in. It tells you something about how she understood her own beauty. Not as a gift exactly, but as a possession that could be lost, hair by hair, day by day, if she wasn't careful. The combing alone took close to an hour, and then came the braiding. Elisabeth's signature hairstyle. She called it her Steckbrieffriese, her wanted poster hairstyle, because the elaborate crown of braids coiled high on top of her head was so distinctive that she could have been identified from it alone, was an architectural achievement. The hair was divided into heavy sections, each one braided tightly, then wound and pinned into a structure that sat on top of her head like a crown. It took immense skill. Almost no one else could replicate it, though plenty of women tried. The braids had to be tight enough to hold all day through court receptions and state dinners, but loose enough not to pull at the scalp. The weight of the finished hairstyle was considerable. Pounds of hair, coiled and pinned and balanced on top of a head that had to remain upright and still, and graceful through hours of public appearances. Elisabeth didn't waste those 3 hours. She read. She wrote letters, long ones to her closest friends, shorter ones to her husband, always in her increasingly fluent Hungarian. She studied languages. For years, it was during these hairdressing sessions that her Hungarian companion Ida Ferenczi sat nearby and conversed with her in Magyar, teaching her idioms and expressions, bringing her news from Budapest, reading her letters from politicians and poets. Later it was Christomanos with his Homer. The hair was the frame, but the hours inside it were full, a private world of books and languages and whispered confidences, unfolding behind a closed door while the comb moved and the pins clicked, and nobody else in the empire was allowed to interrupt. And that weight came with a cost. On bad days, the sheer mass of it pressing down on her skull gave her headaches that lasted for hours, sometimes all day. When that happened, she'd retreat to her private rooms and sit perfectly still, her hair unpinned and hanging loose, suspended from ribbons tied to hooks above her chair. The ribbons held the hair up, took the weight off her scalp, let the air reach her aching head. She'd sit like that for hours, a woman in a white dressing gown with her hair hanging in the air around her, held up by silk ribbons, reading or writing letters or simply sitting with her eyes closed and her head tipped back. It must have looked strange. It must have looked, if you didn't know what you were seeing, like some kind of ceremony, or like a woman caught in a web she'd woven herself, suspended between the beauty and the burden of it. Nobody outside her private rooms ever saw this. The court saw the finished product, the glossy crown of braids, the straight carriage, the head held perfectly level. They didn't see the ribbons. They didn't see the mornings when the weight of her own beauty pressed down on her until she couldn't move. You know what stays with me about this? She didn't have to do any of it. She could have cut her hair. She could have worn it in a simpler style. She was the Empress. Nobody could have told her otherwise. But the hair had become something more than hair. It was the thing she was proudest of. the one part of her beauty she'd built and maintained entirely on her own terms. The court had taken her children. The protocol had taken her freedom. The public had claimed her face and her figure as their property, something they felt entitled to stare at. But the hair, the 3 hours every morning, the silver tray, the cognac and egg, the braids wound tight on top of her head, that was hers. Nobody else decided how it was done. Nobody else had a say. She wrote a poem about it once, later in her life, a strange, dreamy little verse about wanting to pour the last of her life force into her braids, wanting to pass all her strength into the golden waves until she slipped away, drained into sleep. It's an odd poem. It sounds like a lullaby a woman might sing to herself, about herself, in a room where no one else can hear. Every 3 weeks, the daily routine was replaced by something more elaborate, a full washing of the hair. This was an all-day affair, and I mean that literally. It began in the morning and wasn't finished until late afternoon. The formulas changed over the years as Elisabeth experimented with different recipes and essences, but the one she kept coming back to was a mixture of raw egg yolks and cognac, worked into the hair by hand, left to soak, then rinsed out slowly, carefully, the way you'd wash something made of silk. The quantities involved were staggering. Hair that long, hair that heavy, needed basins and basins of warm water just for the rinsing. And the drying afterward was its own marathon. You couldn't wring it out, you couldn't twist it, you had to blot it section by section and then wait. And while you waited, it hung around her like wet rope, dark and heavy and smelling of cognac, dripping quietly onto towels laid across the floor. On washing days, the Empress was unavailable to everyone. No audiences, no visitors, no letters answered. Not even her husband could see her. The whole palace adjusted its rhythm around this one woman's hair, the way a household might adjust around a birth or a storm, everyone stepping carefully, keeping quiet, waiting for it to be done. Elisabeth wrote once to Franz Joseph about how much she dreaded these days, not because of the washing itself, which she seemed to find soothing, but because of the endless drying afterward, the hours of sitting damp and half undone, unable to go anywhere or do anything until her hair was ready to be braided again. There's a rhythm to this kind of care that you can almost feel, even from the outside, even from this distance. The slow, repetitive pull of the comb through heavy, dark hair, the sound of water in a basin, the faint smell of cognac and egg, sharp at first, then settling into something warmer, almost like bread baking somewhere far away. The Empress sitting still for hours, her eyes half closed, while someone else's hands moved through her hair with the kind of attention a restorer gives to an old painting. Careful, unhurried, aware that the material is more fragile than it looks. It's the kind of work that could put you to sleep if you were watching it. And the thing is, it wasn't vanity. Not exactly, or not only. It was closer to what a craftsman does with a piece of wood, running a hand along the grain over and over, not because anyone's watching, but because the material demands it. Elisabeth treated her body the way some people treat a musical instrument, with a discipline that was partly love and partly obligation, and partly something she couldn't quite explain even to herself. She told her Greek tutor Christomanos once that her hair felt like a foreign body on her head. He answered, with the kind of flattery that passed for conversation in these circles, that she wore her hair instead of a crown. And she said, "Yes, but a crown is easier to take off. That line sits with me." She's joking, but she isn't. The hair was hers. More hers than the title, more hers than the palace, more hers than any of the things that had been placed on her by circumstance. But it was also a weight she couldn't set down. 3 hours every morning, every single day for decades. And on the days when the headaches came, she sat in a room with her hair hanging from ribbons overhead, and she waited. Let me tell you about what the hairdressing looked like from the other side of the room. Because for most of the 1890s there was someone else in the room during those 3 hours. A young Greek man named Christomanos, hired as a language tutor, whose job was to sit in the Empress's dressing room and read Homer aloud while her hair was being done. He was clearly overwhelmed by the whole arrangement. He left a detailed account of what he saw, written in the kind of breathless, overheated prose that young men sometimes produce when they are in the presence of someone they can't quite believe is real. The Empress in her chair, utterly still. Behind her, the hairdresser in a black dress with a long train, a white apron so fine it looked like it was made of cobwebs, traces of faded beauty still visible in her face, and eyes, this is what Christomanos noticed, full of dark cunning. The hairdresser's white hands moving through the waves of hair, lifting them, smoothing them, winding them around her arms the way you'd catch water in your hands if it wouldn't stay still. And then, at the end, the white lace dressing gown lifted away and the finished Empress rising from behind it like a dark statue emerging from marble. She wore black almost exclusively by then, the hairdresser bowing so deeply she seemed to sink into the floor, whispering the formal phrase, "At your Majesty's feet I lay myself," and the ritual was done. Christomanos called it a holy act, and maybe that's not wrong. There was something devotional about it, the repetition, the precision, the way both women moved through the same steps every morning as if the order of things mattered, as if doing it right might hold something larger together. The combing, the braiding, the silver tray, the bow. 3 hours, and then the door opened, and the Empress stepped out into whatever the day required of her. The formal audiences, the stiff receptions, the long walks she took in all weather to keep her body from giving into age. But those 3 hours belonged to nobody but her. At 50, she still didn't have a single grey hair, or if she did, her hairdresser made them disappear. And who would know the difference? Elisabeth herself half acknowledged this with a wry aside, as if the question of whether her hair was truly untouched by time or merely maintained to look that way was one of those things she preferred to leave unanswered. The colour had deepened over the decades from golden to chestnut, but the thickness held, the length held, the strength of it held. And every morning, without exception, the whole slow ceremony began again. The knock, the white gown, the chair by the window, the comb moving through the weight of something that had been growing for 30 years and showed no sign of stopping. She was vain about her hair in a way she wasn't vain about anything else. Other parts of her beauty she spoke about with detachment, even contempt. The way the public stared at her, the way the court gossiped about her figure, the way diplomats wrote home to their wives about her eyes. But the hair was different. The hair she loved. She once compared letting it down to putting on a cloak, the way it fell around her, covered her, enclosed her in something private. And the poem she wrote about it, late in life, wasn't about beauty at all. It was about wanting her whole life to drain into those braids, wanting everything she had left, every drop of strength, every last pulse of vitality, to pass into the silk gold waves until there was nothing left of her at all, and she could finally sleep. I think about the women in history who are remembered for their hair. Rapunzel, Godiva, Berenice, who cut hers and placed it in a temple. There's always something sacrificial about it. Hair that long isn't just beautiful, it's a commitment. It's years of patience and stillness, and the willingness to sit in a chair while someone else works. It's choosing, every single morning, not to cut it, not to simplify, not to give yourself back the hours it takes. Elisabeth once said she was a slave to her hair. She said it to Christomanos, matter-of-factly, the way you'd say you were a slave to the weather or to a clock. It wasn't a complaint exactly. It was just the truth of her mornings. After a few days with a substitute hairdresser, when her regular woman was sick or pretending to be sick, which happened more often than anyone liked, Elisabeth would be so worn down, so frayed by the lesser hands in her hair that she'd give in to whatever demand had been made. She knew it. The hairdresser knew it. And still, every morning the door opened and the ritual began again. And there's something about those mornings that I find strangely restful to think about. Not the vanity of it. The vanity is complicated, and we'll get to that. But the rhythm. The pure, slow, repetitive rhythm of a woman sitting still while a comb moves through her hair, while the light changes at the window, while the palace wakes up around her. The quiet scratch of a pen as she writes a letter in Hungarian. The murmur of a Greek poem being read aloud from the far corner of the room. The sound of the pins being placed one by one. The weight of the finished braids settling onto her head like something inevitable. The click of the silver tray being set down on the dressing table, and then the quiet. The brief, held quiet before the door opens and the day begins. She sat like that for 30 years. Her name was Fanny Angerer, and she was the daughter of a barber from the Spittelberg, one of the rougher neighbourhoods in Vienna. She was young, sharp-featured, quick-witted, and she had a talent that no amount of aristocratic breeding could replicate. She could make hair do things it had no business doing. Before the Empress found her, she'd been working backstage at the Burg Theatre, Vienna's imperial playhouse, styling the actresses before they went on. It was good, steady work, It paid decently. Nobody outside the theatre knew her name. That changed one evening when Elisabeth came to see a comedy at the Burg Theatre. She wasn't watching the play exactly, as all she was, but her eye kept drifting to the leading actress, Hélène Gabillon, whose hair was arranged in a way Elisabeth had never seen before. Something about the structure of it, the way it held its shape under the stage lights, the intricacy of the braiding. It was a work of engineering disguised as elegance. After the performance, she asked someone to find out who'd done it. The answer came back, a girl named Fanny, barely out of her teens, the daughter of a Spittelberg barber, working behind the scenes at the Burg Theatre for a modest wage. She was described by people who knew her as having a striking appearance and a quick, sharp humour. Elisabeth wanted her immediately. What followed was months of negotiation so convoluted and so public that even the newspapers got involved. The question of whether a hairdresser or a male barber would serve the Empress had apparently been a matter of debate for some time, and Fanny's appointment settled it with a flourish. In April of 1863, the Morgenpost ran an item under its daily news column announcing that Fräulein Angerer had given up her position, styling the actresses at the Hofburg Theatre, and would henceforth devote herself to the imperial service at an annual salary of 2,000 gulden. The paper added, with a thin smile you can still feel through the ink, that she'd be permitted to take on outside clients if her schedule allowed. 2,000 gulden a year. I want to sit with that number for a moment, because it tells you everything about the world Fanny had just walked into. A university professor earned about the same. The top stars of the Burg Theatre, the leading actors and actresses who performed before the Emperor himself, earned 3,000. And here was a girl from the Spittelberg, the daughter of a neighbourhood barber, being paid nearly as much as any of them to do one woman's hair every morning. Archduchess Sophie was furious about the newspaper coverage and fumed in her diary about the impertinent court gossip columns. But the appointment stood, and Fanny Angerer became the most famous hairdresser in the empire overnight. The ladies of Viennese society noticed. Within weeks they were competing for Fanny's attention, begging her to style their hair for special occasions, balls, opera nights, state dinners. This was the outside work the newspaper had mentioned, and it earned Fanny considerably more than her official salary. Suddenly, a girl who'd been invisible backstage at the theatre was the most sought-after woman in Vienna's dressing rooms. The aristocrats who'd spent years mocking Elisabeth's provincial manners were now lining up to have their hair done by Elisabeth's barber's daughter. There's a kind of justice in that, even if nobody at the time would have called it that. And here's the part I find so interesting. She didn't just do the job, she ran it. Within months, Fanny understood something that most people around the Empress never quite grasped. Elisabeth's mood for the entire day depended on what happened in those 3 hours. A good hairdressing session, no lost hair, a clean comb, a perfectly balanced crown of braids, meant a calm Empress, a cooperating Empress, an Empress who might even show up at a state dinner without complaint. A bad session meant the opposite. And Fanny, who was clever and observant and had grown up in a world where you survived by reading the room, learned to play this knowledge like an instrument. She developed tricks. The most famous one involved the apron. After combing, she was supposed to present the fallen hairs to Elisabeth on a silver tray, and Elisabeth, as we've heard, took every lost strand as a personal defeat. So Fanny started hiding the loose hairs. She'd press them onto a strip of adhesive tape tucked under her white apron, out of sight, and then present the comb to the Empress afterward. Clean, barely a hair on it. Elisabeth would look, nod, and the tension in the room would ease. It was a small deception, but it kept the peace, and it gave Fanny a kind of power that no one at the Hofburg, not the ministers, not the generals, not even the Emperor himself, could match. There's something almost funny about this if you think about it long enough. One of the most powerful women in Europe, the Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, being managed, gently, skillfully, day by day, by a barber's daughter with a roll of tape under her apron. But it wasn't really funny. It was the kind of power that comes from proximity, from being the only person who can do the one thing someone else can't live without. Elisabeth couldn't go to a state function if Fanny wasn't there to do her hair. She couldn't face a court reception. She couldn't appear at a ball. Without Fanny, the whole elaborate machine of imperial beauty ground to a halt, and Fanny knew it. When she was unhappy about something, a slight from a lady-in-waiting, a scheduling conflict, a request she felt was beneath her, she'd call in sick. She'd send a replacement, some other hairdresser or a lady's maid, and let the Empress suffer through the lesser hands. After a few days of this, Elisabeth would be, as she put it herself, completely worn down. Mürbe, the German word she used, which means something like soft and crumbling, the way bread gets when it's been sitting out too long, and then whatever demand Fanny had made would be quietly met, and Fanny would recover from her mysterious illness, and the next morning the knock would come at the door again and everything would return to normal. Elisabeth knew exactly what was happening. She told Christomanos once, with a kind of tired frankness, that after a few days with a substitute hairdresser she'd capitulate to anything. She called herself the slave of her own hair, and the Emperor, who watched all of this from outside the dressing room door, baffled and slightly exasperated, once described a scene in a letter that tells you everything you need to know about the dynamic. The supposedly ill Fanny had arrived in Budapest lying flat on a stretcher, carried from the train station to the palace in an ambulance wagon from the city's rescue service, looking for all the world like a woman at the edge of collapse. Franz Joseph's comment, written with the dry resignation of a man who'd been watching this performance for years, was simple. "It's a misery," he said, "when you depend so completely on the health. And sometimes," he added pointedly, "on the moods of one person." The biggest crisis came when Fanny fell in love. His name was Hugo Pfefferlich, and he was a bank clerk, a perfectly respectable young man from a perfectly ordinary background, with no connection whatsoever to the court. They wanted to marry. But there was a rule, old and rigid, and not open to negotiation. Married women couldn't serve in the imperial household. It had always been this way. The reasoning, if you could call it that, had something to do with divided loyalties. A married woman's first duty was to her husband, not to her employer, even if that employer happened to be the Empress of Austria. If Fanny married Hugo, she'd have to leave. And if she left, there was nobody in the entire empire who could replace her. I think about what that moment must have been like inside the Hofburg. The Empress, who by this point had organised her entire life around those 3 hours every morning, facing the possibility that the one woman who could do her hair the way it needed to be done was about to walk away, not because of illness or ambition or a better offer, but because she'd fallen in love with a bank clerk. It's the kind of problem that no amount of imperial authority is designed to solve. You can't order someone not to fall in love, you can't issue a decree about it, and you can't very well tell a grown woman that she's not allowed to marry because you need your hair braided every morning. Elisabeth went to the Emperor. She asked him personally as a favour, not as an empress to her sovereign, but as a wife to her husband, to make an exception. Let Fanny marry. Let her stay. Franz Joseph, who by now understood perfectly well that his own domestic peace depended on the smooth functioning of his wife's dressing room, agreed. The rule was bent. Fanny married Hugo Pfefferlich and kept her position at court. It was, as far as anyone could tell, the only time the ancient regulation had ever been waived. And then Hugo's life changed. Quietly, steadily, without anyone making a fuss about it, the bank clerk began to rise. It happened the way things happened at the Habsburg court, not with announcements or celebrations, but with small incremental promotions that accumulated over the years like interest in a savings account. He was brought into the imperial household. He became the Empress's private secretary, then her travel marshal, the man who organised her complicated, restless journeys across Europe, booking trains and yachts and hotels in a dozen countries. Then a government councillor, then treasurer of a prestigious imperial order, then a court councillor, and finally he was elevated to the minor nobility, Hugo von Pfefferlich, with a von before his name and a coat of arms he'd never dreamed of having when he was counting other people's money behind a desk in a Viennese bank. All of this because his wife could braid hair in a way that no one else in Europe could replicate. If you'd told Hugo Pfefferlich on the morning he walked into his branch office that he'd end his career as a knight of the realm, he'd have thought you were mad. But that's what proximity does in a court like this one. It doesn't matter where you start, it matters whose hair you can reach. The ladies-in-waiting seethed. Countess Marie Festetics, who genuinely loved the Empress and served her faithfully for years, couldn't hide her irritation at the Pfefferlich couple's growing influence. Fanny had become, in Festetics' acidic phrase, unbelievably grand and arrogant, far more dignified, in fact, than the Empress herself. Which was ironic, because Elisabeth was one of the least dignified monarchs in Europe when she felt like it. She hated ceremony. She hated formality. She'd happily slip out of a banquet early or skip a reception entirely. But Fanny, the barber's daughter from the Spittelberg, had absorbed the manners of the court so thoroughly that she carried herself like a duchess, and Elisabeth, with that streak of mischief that surfaced whenever life at court became too stifling, found a use for Fanny's impressive bearing. She turned her into a double. More than once, when travelling abroad, Elisabeth would send Fanny out in her place, dressed well, standing tall, accepting the bows and the flowers and the municipal delegations, while the real empress slipped away through a side door to wander the streets alone. The most famous time was in Smyrna. It was 1885 and the empress's yacht had docked in the harbour. The city officials had arranged a welcome, a ceremonial boat to carry the empress across the water, speeches prepared, dignitaries lined up. But Elisabeth didn't want any of it, so Fanny climbed into the ceremonial boat instead. She sat in the place of honour, back straight, expression composed, and let the officials of Smyrna row her around the harbour while they delivered their prepared speeches to her. Meanwhile, Elisabeth was already ashore, having taken a small rowboat to the dock, walking through the streets unrecognised, looking at whatever she wanted to look at, answering to nobody. There's something about that image I can't shake. The hairdresser in the ceremonial boat receiving the salute of a foreign city, while the empress, the real one, walks bareheaded through a market somewhere, free. Two women who'd spent 30 years in a small room together, one standing behind the other with a comb, and now here they were, playing out their strange partnership on the deck of a boat in a Turkish harbour. It happened again in Marseille, almost 10 years later, in 1894. The Empress was leaving by train, and a crowd had gathered on the platform to see her off. Elisabeth's lady-in-waiting, Countess Stare, described the scene in her memoirs. Under normal circumstances, Stare wrote, "This kind of attention made the Empress deeply uncomfortable. She'd pull her parasol lower, turn her face away, walk faster. But this time she was delighted, because the crowd's curiosity had already been fully satisfied before Elisabeth even appeared." Fanny was pacing the platform in her most regal manner, back straight, chin lifted, performing the role of Empress so convincingly that nobody looked twice when the real one slipped past them and boarded the train unnoticed. "Don't disturb the good woman," Elisabeth whispered to Stare, laughing quietly, and stepped aboard while the crowd continued to admire her hairdresser. I don't know of another relationship quite like this one in the courts of 19th century Europe. It wasn't friendship exactly. The distance between an empress and her hairdresser was too vast for that, no matter how many years they spent in the same room, and it wasn't simple employment. No employee gets to call in sick as a negotiating tactic and keep her job for 30 years. It was something stranger and more tangled than either of those things. Two women bound together by hair, by habit, by a mutual dependence neither of them could quite admit to out loud. Fanny needed the Empress for her livelihood, her husband's career, her position in the world, everything she'd built since leaving the Burg Theatre, and Elisabeth needed Fanny for the 3 hours that held her life together every morning. The combing, the braiding, the silver tray, the quiet. Take those 3 hours away and the whole structure of her days collapsed. She'd said it herself. She was the slave of her hair, and Fanny was the one who held the key. Fanny served Elisabeth for 3 decades. She stood behind that chair through the Empress's youth and middle age and the beginning of her slow retreat from the world. She watched the hair darken from blonde to chestnut. She watched the headaches get worse. She watched the Empress grow thinner and more restless and harder to please. She hid the falling strands under her apron and presented a clean comb and never, as far as we know, let on how much hair was really being lost. And in return she got something almost nobody else in the empire had, a kind of unshakable proximity to power. Not political power, not the kind that moves armies or signs treaties, but the small, daily, irreplaceable power of being the one person in the room who can't be substituted. The Countess of Aesthetics, for all her jealousy, understood this better than anyone. She wrote in her diary that the Pfäfferlich couple's influence over the Empress was immense, and that its source was simply the fact that Elisabeth couldn't face the morning without Fanny standing behind her. Everything else, the husband's titles, the salary, the social climbing, all of it flowed from that one unalterable fact. The Empress needed her hair done, and only one woman could do it right. She was a barber's daughter from one of the poorest streets in Vienna. She became, in her own quiet way, one of the most influential women at the Habsburg court. And all of it, the salary, the husband's knighthood, the ceremonial boats, the crowds at foreign railway stations bowing to her by mistake. All of it came down to what she could do with a comb and a pair of steady hands, in a room where the curtains were drawn and the only sound was the slow pull of bristles through chestnut hair. That's the kingdom she built. Not large, not visible from the outside, but entirely hers. The hair took 3 hours, the dressing took another 3. And sometimes, when the day called for more than one outfit, when there was a morning ride and an afternoon walk and an evening dinner, the whole process had to be done 2 or 3 times over, each time from scratch. Because Elisabeth didn't just put on her clothes the way other women did, she was sewn into them. Let's start with the corset. Every morning, after the bath and the gymnastics and the 3 hours of hair, a different kind of work began. The corset was brought out, stiff-boned, laced up the back, and the process of pulling it tight around Elisabeth's body could take up to an hour on its own. The goal was a waist that measured 50 centimetres. That's just under 20 inches. On a woman who stood 172 centimetres tall, 5'8", a 20-inch waist looked almost impossible. And it was, without help. So every morning someone stood behind her and pulled, notch by notch, cinching the laces tighter, while Elisabeth held her breath and braced herself against the pressure. I don't want to make this sound more dramatic than it was. Corsets were normal. Every woman in the 1860s and 70s wore one. It was as basic as putting on shoes. But Elisabeth's was tighter than most, tighter than almost anyone's. Tight enough that it worried her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who noted more than once in her diary that the young Empress seemed to have trouble breathing. The Prussian Crown Princess Victoria noticed it too, when she met Elisabeth in the early 60s, and wrote to Queen Victoria that the Empress was surely laced far tighter than necessary for such a magnificent figure. But the tightness wasn't vanity for its own sake, it was maintenance. Once you'd become famous for having the smallest waist in Europe, once diplomats wrote home about it, once painters built portraits around it, once your waist had become a matter of public record, you had to keep having it. Every public appearance was a test. Every gown was a verdict. If the waist looked even slightly wider than it had the year before, someone would notice and someone would talk. So the corset came first, and it came tight, and it stayed tight all day. And the remarkable thing, the thing that borders on the impossible, is that her measurements barely changed over the course of her adult life. 50 centimetres at 20, 50 centimetres at 40, 50 centimetres, or very close to it, at 50. Decades of discipline holding that number in place like a constant in an equation that otherwise kept changing. Then came the undergarments. And here's where Elisabeth departed sharply from every other woman of her time. In the 1870s, well into the age of elaborate petticoats, layers of flannel and silk and pique stacked one on top of another, she stopped wearing petticoats altogether. Instead, she wore thin trousers made of the softest deerskin leather, so fine you could almost see through them. Nothing else underneath. Just the leather against her skin, flexible and close-fitting, moving with her body instead of against it. This was, for the 1870s, genuinely radical. Respectable women wore layers. They wore chemises and drawers and petticoats and crinolines and overskirts, a whole architecture of fabric between their bodies and the outside world. Elisabeth stripped most of it away. She wanted to feel her own body. She wanted the line of the dress to follow the line of her waist and her hips without interference, and the deerskin, thin, supple, almost like a second skin, gave her that. It also meant that the dresses she wore had to fit with surgical precision, because there was nothing underneath to disguise a mistake. And this is where the sewing came in. Elisabeth's dresses weren't fastened with buttons or hooks, the way other women's clothes were. They were stitched shut. Every morning, once the corset was laced and the leather undergarments were on, a dressmaker or a lady's maid would literally sew Elisabeth into whatever she was wearing that day. Tiny stitches, pulled tight, closing the seams around her body so that the fabric lay flat against her waist and hips without a single wrinkle or gap. No button could achieve that kind of closeness. No hook could hold that line. Only thread and needle worked by hand, stitch by stitch, while the Empress stood perfectly still and waited. And here's the thing that makes it exhausting just to think about. When she needed to change clothes, the whole process had to be reversed. The stitches were cut open, the dress was removed, a new corset tightening if the outfit required a different cut. New leather undergarments if the first pair had been worn riding, and then the sewing again, the dressmaker on her knees with a needle, stitching the new dress shut around the Empress's body while the afternoon light moved across the dressing room floor. The riding habit was its own ordeal. Elisabeth rode nearly every day, in the Prater, in the Spanish riding school, later in the hunting fields of England and Ireland, and her riding clothes were sewn shut around her body just like everything else. The habit had to be tight enough that it wouldn't shift or bunch during hard riding, close enough to her legs that it wouldn't catch in the stirrups. Being sewn into a riding habit and then spending hours on horseback, then being cut out of the habit and sewn into a walking dress, and then cut out of that and sewn into an evening gown. That was a normal day. 3 complete assemblies and 3 complete disassemblies of the same body, from the skin outward. Her daily schedule in the 70s and 80s tells the whole story. Up at 5 in summer, 6 in winter, a cold bath, massage, gymnastics on the rings and bars, a spare breakfast, sometimes nothing but a glass of milk or broth, then 3 hours of hair, then the first dressing, sewn into whatever the morning required. A brief meal that was over in minutes because she ate almost nothing. Then a forced march of several hours in the company of a lady-in-waiting who had to be fit enough to keep up. Then, around 5 in the afternoon, the whole process again. New hair arrangement, new dress, new sewing. If a family dinner couldn't be avoided, she appeared around 7, saw her husband, often for the only time that day, and withdrew as soon as she could. Her friend Ada Ferenczi would come to her rooms, help her undress, unpin the braids, and the day was done. On a day with 3 outfit changes, a riding habit in the morning, a walking dress for the afternoon, an evening gown for a state dinner, that's 3 separate sewings, 3 separate cuttings open, hours spent standing still while someone works a needle along the seam of your hip. I think about the women who did this work, whose names we'll never know. The chambermaids and seamstresses who knelt at the Empress's feet and stitched her into garment after garment, year after year, following the same seams, pulling the same thread tight, their fingers stiff from the repetition. They're invisible in the historical record. But their hands were on her body every day, and without them the whole performance couldn't have happened. And I think about the sheer volume of it all. When Elisabeth first arrived in Vienna as a bride of 16, her trousseau had been catalogued down to the last hairpin. 144 chemises, most of them batiste trimmed with lace. 60 pairs of stockings, silk and cotton. 113 pairs of shoes. Atlas, velvet, silk. Almost all of them designed to be worn only once and then given away. That was the rule at court. The Empress wore her shoes for a single day, and then they were passed along to the staff. Elisabeth, who'd grown up running barefoot through the fields of Possenhofen, found this absurd and eventually stopped doing it. But the volume of clothing never decreased. If anything, it grew. More gowns, more riding habits, more walking dresses, more evening ensembles, all of them requiring the same meticulous process of being sewn shut around a body that weighed 50 kilograms and had a waist the width of a dinner plate. You know, there's something almost architectural about the way Elisabeth dressed. The corset was the foundation. The leather undergarments were the walls. The dress sewn shut around her was the facade. And the woman inside all of it, the actual breathing, living woman that was held so tightly in place that she could barely move without feeling the pull of thread against skin. She used the phrase herself once, being put in harness. Insgeschirr, ingespannt. That's how she described it. The same words you'd use for a draft horse being hitched to a plough. And each time she had to appear in public, the whole harness went on again. Every other empress before her had it easier. Not easy. No one said being a Habsburg was easy, but easier than this. Because no empress before Elisabeth had carried the weight of being the most famous beauty in Europe. The previous empresses could appear at a reception in a reasonably elegant dress with a reasonably tidy hairstyle, and nobody would have written home about it. Elisabeth couldn't. Every dress had to be perfect. Every hair had to be in place. Every seam had to lie flat. The standard she'd set, or that had been set for her by the admiring, devouring public, was so high that meeting it required half the day, every day for decades. And here's where I think the connection between Elisabeth's dressing and her increasing reluctance to appear in public starts to make sense. It's not just that she was shy, or anxious, or bored by the formal circles and state dinners. It's that every public appearance required hours of physical preparation that were genuinely punishing. 3 hours for the hair, an hour for the corset, another hour or more for the sewing and the fitting. By the time she was ready to walk out of her dressing room and into a ballroom, she'd already spent most of the day being worked on, pulled, laced, stitched, pinned. No wonder she began to avoid it. No wonder she found excuses, a headache, a cough, a vague illness that required fresh air and solitude. It wasn't laziness, it wasn't caprice, though the court certainly called it that. It was exhaustion, the deep accumulated tiredness of a woman who spent 6 hours a day being physically assembled, like a piece of furniture being put together and taken apart and put together again. And then there was the question of style. Because Elisabeth didn't just dress, she dressed against someone. Her rival, though she'd never have used that word, was Pauline Metternich, the granddaughter of the famous Chancellor, wife of the Austrian ambassador to Paris, and the most powerful woman in Viennese fashion. Pauline was everything Elisabeth wasn't. Loud, social, confident, unapologetic. She'd made her name in Paris, where she was one of Empress Eugenie's closest friends and a fixture of the French court's social whirl. When she returned to Vienna after the fall of Napoleon III in 1871, she simply continued where she'd left off. She set the trends. She decided which fabrics were in season, which hat shapes were acceptable, which colours were fashionable. In an age before fashion magazines or runway shows, the first ladies of society were the ones who showed everyone else what to wear. And in Vienna, that lady wasn't the Empress. It was Pauline Metternich. Pauline was covered in jewellery, heavy with perfume, painted with cosmetics, her eyebrows darkened, her skin whitened, her dresses layered with imported fabrics and elaborate trimmings. She was, in every possible sense, decorated, and she knew exactly what she was doing. She'd once compared Elisabeth to the princesses of blood who had no idea how to make themselves interesting, and then, just to make sure everyone understood who she meant, added that Archduchess Sophie had been a far better conversationalist in her day. The court nicknamed her Pauline Metternich, a pun on her sharp tongue. Elisabeth went the other direction. She wore no makeup. She used no strong perfume. The heavy floral scents that Pauline favoured were, to Elisabeth, as offensive as bad taste itself. She didn't pile on diamonds or drape herself in furs. Her style was restrained, understated even, but exquisite in the way that only extreme care and expense can produce. The fabrics were the finest available, chosen for texture rather than pattern. The cuts were precise, so precise that the sewing had to be done by hand every morning to achieve them. The colours were muted or stark, black later, almost exclusively black. And the beauty that held it all together wasn't manufactured. It was, in her mind at least, natural, grown, earned through discipline and denial and cold baths at dawn, not painted on or pinned in place. She wrote a poem about Pauline Metternich once, after they'd both attended a charity ball. The verse was cruel in the quiet, specific way that Elisabeth's cruelty always was. She described Pauline standing in a circle of women, the loudest voice in the room, her head heavy with diamonds, her body strapped into rich foreign fabric, her face painted white, her eyebrows darkened, her expression, and here Elisabeth really lets go, like 100 monkeys performing mockingly behind her features. It's a vicious portrait. But it tells you something about what beauty meant to Elisabeth, and what it didn't. For her, beauty was the body itself, the skin, the hair, the bones underneath. Anything you added on top of that was false. Anything you painted or glued or draped was a lie. And Pauline, who represented everything artificial and socially ambitious about Viennese court life, was the living embodiment of that lie. The conflict between them wasn't really about fashion. It was about two completely different ideas of what a woman in power was supposed to be. Pauline stepped into the public role that Elisabeth refused. The charity organiser, the social hostess, the cultural patron, the woman who showed up. She opened her salon to the Rothschilds and the industrialists. She supported artists and musicians. She was visible, active, engaged. And Elisabeth, who believed the whole system was a cage, withdrew further and further into her private rooms, her private rituals, her private body. There's something I find almost unbearably sad about the dressing, when I think about it long enough. All those hours, all those stitches. The corset pulled tight every morning, the thread drawn through the fabric every afternoon, the scissors cutting her free every evening. And at the centre of it, a woman who didn't want to be seen, who genuinely, physically dreaded the moment the dressing room door would open and she'd have to walk out into a room full of people who wanted to look at her. The beauty that required 6 hours of daily maintenance was also the beauty she was trapped inside of. She couldn't have one without the other. The fame and the confinement were the same thing, sewn into the same seam. And every evening at the end of the day, Ida Ferenczi would come to her rooms, the friend, not the hairdresser, and Ida would help her undo it all. Cut the stitches one last time, unlace the corset, let the hair down from its crown of braids. The Empress would sit there in the candlelight, slowly coming undone layer by layer, seam by seam, until she was just a woman in a nightgown with loose hair and bare feet. The deerskin undergarments folded on a chair, the corset hanging open like an empty shell, the dress slit along its seams, lying across the bed like something that had been shed. And for a few quiet hours before sleep, she didn't belong to anyone. She could talk with Ida in Hungarian, she could write her strange Heine-inspired poems, she could simply sit in the dark and be still. Nobody was looking at her. Nobody needed her to be anything. Then morning came, and the needle came out again. 5 o'clock in summer, 6 in winter. That's when her day started. Before the sun, before the servants, before the rest of the Hofburg had any idea the Empress was awake. The first thing was the bath. Cold water. Not lukewarm, not cool. Cold. The kind of cold that makes your chest tighten and your breath catch. She stepped into it the way you'd step into a river in early spring, quickly, without hesitation, because hesitation would make it worse. Then she stood there, or sat, while the water did its work, tightening the skin, pulling the blood inward, waking the body up in a way no amount of coffee or conversation could match. She did this every single morning, in every season, in every palace, for decades. After the bath came a massage, firm, thorough, working through the muscles of her arms and shoulders and legs, loosening whatever the night had stiffened. By the time the massage was done, the sky outside her windows would just be starting to lighten. And then the gymnastics. Every palace she lived in, the Hofburg in Vienna, the royal castle in Budapest, the hunting lodge at Gödöllő, later even her private villa on Corfu, had a room fitted out with equipment. Rings suspended from the ceiling on leather straps, parallel bars, polished smooth from years of use, a horizontal bar, dumbbells and weights of various sizes, from light ones for the wrists to heavy iron pieces that would have been at home in a men's gymnasium, and a low rope, stretched taut between 2 posts, just high enough to require a jump to clear it. Elisabeth used all of them, every single day for decades. She trained on the rings the way a gymnast trains, pulling herself up by her arms, holding her body suspended in the air, lowering herself slowly until her feet touched the floor, and then pulling herself up again. She worked the parallel bars with her arms until the muscles burned. She lifted the dumbbells with a steady, deliberate rhythm that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with control. The same kind of control she applied to her hair, her diet, her waist, every aspect of a body she'd decided was her responsibility and hers alone. This was her morning. Every morning. Before the hair, before the corset, before any of the more visible rituals began, there was this, a woman alone in a room full of iron and leather, working her body in the dark before dawn. Nobody watched. Nobody applauded. The ladies in waiting were still asleep. The court was silent. It was the most private hour of her most private routine, and she guarded it fiercely. I want you to picture what this looked like to someone who wasn't expecting it. Because there's a scene that Christomanos describes in his diary from New Year's Day, 1892, that I think captures the whole strangeness of Elisabeth's relationship with her own body better than anything else in the historical record. He'd been called to her salon for a reading of Homer before she went out for the afternoon. When he arrived, he found her hanging from the gymnastic rings in the open doorway between her salon and her boudoir. She was 54 years old, and she was wearing a black silk gown with a long train, edged with magnificent black ostrich feathers, the kind of dress you'd wear to receive visiting royalty, which was exactly what she was about to do. She hung there, swinging slightly, her body extended, the silk and feathers swaying beneath her, and Christomanos, who was young, bookish, and entirely unprepared for the sight of a middle-aged empress in full evening dress suspended from ceiling rings, simply stood in the doorway and stared. She let herself down and stepped over the low rope with a small jump. "That rope is there," she told him, "so I don't forget how to jump. My father was a great hunter, and he wanted us to learn to spring like chamois." Then she asked him to continue with the Odyssey, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had to receive some archduchesses shortly, and that was why she was dressed so formally. "If the archduchesses knew I'd been doing gymnastics in this dress," she said, "they'd be petrified." Christomanos wrote that hanging from the ropes she'd look like something between a snake and a bird, a creature caught mid-transformation, neither one thing nor the other. He'd never seen her so splendidly dressed, and the contrast between the black feathered gown and the rough leather straps of the gymnastic rings gave the whole scene a quality of hallucination. He was supposed to be reading Homer. Instead, he was watching an empress in ostrich feathers swing from the ceiling of the Hofburg. There's something about that scene that I can't stop thinking about. The contrast between the feathered gown and the gymnastic rings. The absolute matter-of-factness of it. The way she didn't see anything unusual in what she was doing, or if she did, she enjoyed the absurdity. And underneath all of it, the discipline. 54 years old, and she was still jumping over a rope in a ball gown because her father had told her, decades ago, that his daughters should move like mountain goats. She hadn't forgotten. She hadn't let the court or the protocol or the years of silk and candlelight soften her into stillness. The body was still hers, and she was still working it every morning before anyone else was awake. When the newspapers first got wind of the Empress's daily gymnastics, back in the 1860s, nobody believed it. A reporter wrote that the Knights' Hall in the Hofburg had been fitted out as a gymnasium, and that the Emperor himself, along with several archdukes and an elderly field marshal, was training there daily in exercise clothing. The idea that it might be the Empress, a woman in a leotard on the parallel bars, was so unthinkable that the journalist simply replaced her with the nearest plausible men. Franz Joseph was furious when he read the article, not because it mentioned gymnastics, but because it placed them in the Knights' Hall, one of the most ceremonial rooms in the palace, the very room where he delivered his speeches from the throne. He wrote to his adjutant asking whether the story was too stupid to bother denying, and added that they needed to find some way to make the newspaper's editors feel the consequences of their indecency. Elisabeth ignored the gossip and kept training. For a woman of her era, this was genuinely scandalous. Respectable women didn't sweat. They didn't grip iron bars with chalked hands. They didn't hang from rings with their feet off the ground. But Elisabeth had never particularly cared what respectable women did, and the results spoke for themselves. In a century that turned 30-year-old mothers into matronly figures, thick-waisted, heavy-footed, settled into middle age before they'd properly left youth, she maintained the figure of a young woman for 3 decades. At 40, she still appeared at the great court balls looking as slim and upright as she had at 25, her waist still impossibly narrow, her posture still that of someone who spent every morning training her body the way a rider trains a horse. The gymnastics were only one part of it. She also fenced, not as a pastime, but seriously in proper fencing costume with a real instructor. And every afternoon, she walked, not strolled, not promenaded. She walked for hours, at a pace so fast that her ladies-in-waiting, who were required to accompany her, so could barely keep up. It was more of a forced march than a walk, covering miles of parkland and forest in all weather, rain or shine, heat or snow. The women assigned to walk with her had to be young, fit, and willing to destroy their shoes on a daily basis. Those who couldn't match her pace were replaced. Countess Festetics, who was among the hardier ones, still wrote in her diary about the difficulty of keeping step with the Empress, who strode through the grounds of Schönbrunn or Gödöllő as if she were trying to outpace something invisible behind her. And then there was the skin. Because the gymnastics kept the shape, but the skin needed its own kind of attention, and as the first signs of aging arrived, Elisabeth responded not by accepting them, but by intensifying everything. The years of sun and wind during her long outdoor walks had weathered her complexion. Her joints ached. Fine lines appeared where the skin had once been smooth, and her answer was to push harder. More hours on the rings, more hours at the parallel bars, heavier weights, stricter fasting. She wasn't fighting age the way most people fight it, with resignation and a few concessions. She was fighting it the way a general fights a war, with total commitment and no plans for retreat. Her methods were, even by the standards of an era that had no shortage of strange beauty treatments, remarkable. At night, she slept in a face mask made of raw veal, thin slices of calf meat pressed against her skin and held in place while she slept, designed to keep the complexion smooth and pale. During strawberry season, she'd switch to a mask made of crushed strawberries, gentler, sweeter smelling, but serving the same purpose. For the rest of her body, she took baths in warm olive oil, submerging herself in it the way you'd sink into a warm lake, letting the oil coat her skin and seep into the pores. Her niece Marie Larish, who recorded many of these details with a mixture of fascination and disdain, noted that on one occasion the olive oil was heated almost to boiling, and Elisabeth narrowly escaped being scalded, a fate that Larish compared, with her characteristic dark humour, to the martyrdom of early Christian saints. At night she wrapped wet towels around her hips and waist before sleeping. Cold, damp cloths pressed against the skin, held in place through the night, designed to keep her midsection as thin as possible. She drank a mixture that Larish described as truly disgusting. 5 or 6 raw egg whites beaten with salt, swallowed in one go, sometimes as her only sustenance for the day. She ate almost nothing of substance for days at a time, sometimes only a small cup of meat broth, clear and thin, barely more than flavoured water, sometimes nothing at all. During formal dinners, when the whole court sat watching, she'd lift a fork to her mouth and set it down again, push food around a plate, take a sip of something and leave the rest. The family dinners with Franz Josef, which were already brief because she arrived late and left early, were over in minutes, because there was almost nothing on her plate to begin with. Her weight held at 50 kilograms, year after year, decade after decade, 110 pounds on a frame that stood 5'8". By modern standards, that's significantly underweight. By the standards of her own era, which admired rounded figures and full cheeks and the comfortable solidity of a well-fed woman, it was extraordinary. She looked different from every other woman at court. She looked different from every other woman in Europe. And she kept it that way through an act of sustained, daily, almost monastic self-denial that never stopped and never eased. There were no holidays from it, no birthday exceptions, no season when the rules relaxed, no year when she said, enough. The body was a project, and the project didn't have an end date. And here's what I think is so strange about all of this, if you step back from it. The cold baths weren't pleasant. The raw veal on her face wasn't pleasant. The egg whites with salt were, by all accounts, revolting. The wet towels at night were uncomfortable. The gymnastics were hard, physical work. And the diet, the constant, lifelong refusal of food, was its own form of suffering. None of this was enjoyable. None of it was done for pleasure. It was discipline, pure and simple. The discipline of a woman who decided that her body was the one thing in her life she could control, and who intended to control it absolutely no matter what it cost. Her father, Duke Max, had taught his daughters to walk by telling them to watch the butterflies. She told this to Christomanos with a kind of rueful pride. Pride in the old man, not in herself. My sisters and the Queen of Naples are famous in Paris for the way they walk, she said. But we don't walk the way queens are supposed to walk. The Bourbons, who almost never went on foot, developed their own way of moving, like proud geese. They walk like real kings. The contempt in her voice was unmistakable. She didn't want to move like a queen. She wanted to move like something natural. A butterfly, a chamois, a creature that hadn't been taught to hold itself in a particular way for the benefit of an audience. And the irony, of course, an irony she may or may not have been aware of, is that she spent 6 hours a day in front of a mirror being shaped and sewn and pinned into exactly the kind of artificial form she claimed to despise. The naturalness she prized so highly was by this point in her life the most manufactured thing about her. But the result was undeniable. German Emperor Wilhelm II, who met her in her later years, wrote that she didn't sit down, she let herself descend. She didn't stand up, she rose. Every movement had a gravity to it, a quality of being both entirely natural and entirely deliberate, as if her body had been practicing for so long that the effort had become invisible. That's what 30 years of daily training looks like from the outside. Effortlessness. The cold baths, the rings, the parallel bars, the veal masks, the egg whites, the empty stomach. All of it compressed into a single fluid gesture, a single quiet step, a way of crossing a room that made the Italian Queen Margherita look, as one observer wrote, like a soubrette standing next to a demigod. Her daughter, Marie Valerie, who adored her, wrote in her diary after a family dinner, Mama in a black pearl jersey, a black feather in her hair, a gold chain around her neck. Oh, she was so beautiful. Mama didn't look much older than me. Valerie was 14 at the time. Elisabeth was 44. The gap between what her body endured every morning and what it showed every evening was the measure of a discipline so complete that it had become invisible, even to the people who lived closest to her. Valerie saw her mother as a kind of miracle. She didn't see the cold bath. She didn't see the rings. She didn't see the meat broth that was dinner or the veal that was a pillowcase. She saw the result. The woman gliding into a room in black silk, looking as if time had simply decided to leave her alone. And when the Italian Queen Margherita visited Vienna in 1881, a court observer wrote that she looked like a soubrette standing next to a demigod. That's what people saw when they looked at Elisabeth. Something almost supernatural. Something that didn't seem to have been made by human effort. But it had been. It was made every morning, in the dark, on the rings, in cold water, on an empty stomach. Every day for 30 years. But I keep thinking about the mornings, the cold water, the rings, the empty plate, the slow, solitary work of maintaining a body that the world had decided was its most valuable object. There's a kind of loneliness in that, in being your own project, your own sculpture, your own keeper. Nobody helped her onto the rings. Nobody told her when to stop. She'd set the terms of her own captivity, and she honoured them every day with the dedication of someone who'd confused discipline with freedom and couldn't quite find her way back. The court saw beauty. The public saw a fairy queen. What she saw, I think, when she looked in the mirror after all those hours of work was something she'd built with her own hands. The only thing in her life that nobody else could take credit for and nobody else could take away. The bath water was always cold. The mornings were dark, and she kept getting up. It started in Venice, in 1862. Elisabeth was 24, newly arrived at the imperial residence on the lagoon, and she'd just begun the strange hobby that would occupy her for the rest of the decade, collecting photographs of beautiful women. Not paintings, not sketches, photographs. The new technology had made it possible to capture a face with an accuracy that no painter could match, and Elisabeth wanted faces, dozens of them, eventually hundreds. She wasn't the first person in her family to collect beauty. Her uncle, King Ludwig I of Bavaria, had assembled a famous gallery of painted portraits at Hofburg Palace, beautiful women from all walks of life, arranged side by side without regard for rank or station. A baker's daughter hung next to a princess. A shoemaker's wife shared a wall with an archduchess. The most famous portrait of all was his notorious mistress Lola Montez, the dancer whose scandal had cost Ludwig his throne in 1848, and whose portrait still hangs there today, drawing tourists who come to see the face that toppled a king. Among the royal beauties in the gallery was one face Elisabeth knew well, her own mother-in-law Archduchess Sophie, painted in her youth, before the years of court intrigue had hardened her into the formidable woman Elisabeth would later clash with so bitterly. Ludwig had thought Sophie beautiful. Elisabeth, who thought Sophie many things but beautiful was not usually among them, must have found this ironic. Elisabeth knew the gallery well. She'd grown up near it, walked past those faces as a girl, understood the impulse behind them. But her uncle had collected paintings of women he personally knew or desired, or wanted to possess some image of. Elisabeth wanted something different. She wanted photographs of women she'd never met, women she might never meet, women whose beauty existed for her only as a small rectangle of light and shadow on a visiting card. She wrote to her brother-in-law, Archduke Ludwig Victor, a man who spent a great deal of time in the company of Vienna's photographers and portrait studios, and asked him plainly, "I'm putting together a beauty album and I'm collecting photographs, only female ones. Whatever pretty faces you can find at Angera's studio and other photographers, please send them to me." The request was casual, almost offhand, as if she were asking him to pick up a few books from a shop. But the album she was building was anything but casual. It would grow to contain over 100 portraits, women of every rank and nationality from empresses to circus performers, all of them chosen for one quality and one quality only. And then she went further. She went through the foreign ministry. Formal instructions were sent to Austrian embassies across Europe. His Imperial Majesty's consort desires photographs of beautiful women from the principal capitals of Europe for her private collection. The diplomats, when they received these orders, didn't quite know what to make of them. Several suspected the request was a prank, or that some ministry clerk was using the Empress's name to procure photographs for his own amusement. More than one civil servant found himself the subject of awkward questions. Why exactly did he need visiting card portraits of attractive women from abroad? It took time and repeated assurances from Vienna before the embassies accepted that the request was genuine, that the Empress of Austria truly did want photographs of strangers she considered beautiful, and that this was now, officially, part of the diplomatic service's duties. Eventually the portraits began to arrive. From London came photographs of society beauties. Aristocratic women posed in the best studios of the West End, surrounded by mirrors and silk drapes and painted backdrops, wearing the latest fashions, standing in the careful, composed postures that Victorian portrait photography demanded. Each photograph was a small production, the studio hired for the afternoon, the dress chosen with care, the hairdresser engaged, the pose rehearsed, the exposure held for long, still seconds while the subject tried not to blink. From Berlin, more of the same. Women of the Prussian court, their posture militarily precise, their expressions guarded. From St. Petersburg, women in furs and jewels, their faces pale and still under the northern light. The photographs arriving in Vienna weeks later, slightly curled from the journey. I keep thinking about those diplomats, sitting in their offices in foreign capitals, sifting through photographs and trying to decide which faces were pretty enough for the Empress. What a strange assignment. What an odd use of the imperial diplomatic service. The same network that tracked alliances and negotiated treaties and reported on the movements of armies, now being asked to hunt for cheekbones and jawlines, and the particular way light falls across a young woman's brow. There's something almost surreal about it, and I think Elisabeth knew that, and I think she enjoyed it. The real trouble came from Constantinople. The ambassador there received the same instructions as everyone else, but with an additional request that made his job considerably harder. The formal dispatch from the Foreign Ministry read, in the stiff bureaucratic language of Habsburg diplomacy, Her Imperial Majesty the Empress desires for her private collection photographed portraits of beautiful women from the principal capitals of Europe. She would place particular value on receiving, in addition to such portraits of Oriental beauties, photographs of beautiful women from the Turkish harem world. The ambassador was instructed to fulfill this wish as promptly as local conditions permitted in the customary visiting card format. Local conditions, as it turned out, were not permitting at all. The ambassador wrote back to the Foreign Ministry with barely concealed exasperation. The matter is more difficult than it might seem, he said, particularly with regard to Turkish women, who with very few exceptions will not allow themselves to be photographed, and can least of all be persuaded to do so by their husbands. One imagines him sitting in his office overlooking the Bosphorus, staring at this dispatch from Vienna, trying to figure out how to explain to the Ottoman upper class that the Austrian Empress wanted photographs of their wives for a scrapbook. He tried his best. Eventually he sent a batch of portraits from Constantinople, women of uncertain origin and, by Viennese standards, rather exotic appearance, whose connection to any actual harem was left diplomatically vague. The Foreign Ministry forwarded them to Elisabeth without comment, and she added them to the album alongside the London debutantes and the Berlin aristocrats, as if they were all part of the same collection, which, for her, they were. And then there was Paris, and Paris is where the story turns from eccentric to something sharper. The photographs that arrived from the Austrian embassy in Paris were not what anyone expected. They weren't portraits of society ladies. They weren't images of the women who orbited Empress Eugenie's glittering court. They weren't even particularly fashionable. What arrived instead, in neat stacks of visiting card-sized prints, were dozens of photographs of circus performers, acrobats, dancers, actresses, horseback riders from travelling shows, women in costumes that were, by the standards of the 1860s, remarkably sparse, bare arms, low necklines, poses that hovered on the edge of scandal. The concept of beauty, the accompanying note explained blandly, is elastic. It was an insult. A precise, carefully aimed, deniable insult. And for anyone who knew the backstory, the message was clear. Elisabeth's father, Duke Max, kept a private circus in his Munich courtyard. A real circus, with seats and stalls and programmes, where he performed riding stunts alongside professional clowns and acrobats, while Munich society sat in the audience and pretended this was perfectly normal for a member of the ruling family. He'd raised his daughters among these performers. Elisabeth had grown up watching them, befriending them, learning from them, and the Viennese aristocracy, the real aristocracy, the ones who traced their bloodlines back to the Crusades, had never entirely forgiven her for coming from that world. The Wittelsbach family was royal, yes, but it was also eccentric in ways that made the Habsburgs deeply uncomfortable. By sending circus performers instead of countesses, the Paris embassy was saying with impeccable diplomatic politeness, "This is where your family comes from. This is your level. These are your people." The hand behind the insult belonged, almost certainly, to Pauline Metternich. Her husband was the Austrian ambassador in Paris. She was the one who decided what happened in that embassy's social life, who was invited, who was excluded, what impression of Austria was presented to the French court. And she was the one who would have had the final say over which photographs were selected and sent to Vienna. The whole thing had the quality of a Pauline Metternich production, subtle enough to deny if confronted, sharp enough to wound if understood, and perfectly calibrated to hit Elisabeth where she was most sensitive, her origins, her father's eccentricities, the gap between who she was by birth and who she had become by marriage. Pauline had once told a room full of people that the princesses of royal blood were all awkward, hybrid creatures who didn't know the world, and then, just in case anyone missed the point, had added that Archduchess Sophie, Elisabeth's mother-in-law, had been a far better conversationalist. The circus photographs were the visual equivalent of that remark, a reminder, wrapped in a compliment about flexible beauty standards, that Elisabeth would never quite belong. Elisabeth never acknowledged the insult publicly. She added the photographs to her album alongside the London Countesses and the Constantinople Mysteries and the Berlin Aristocrats, as if a circus acrobat in a spangled costume had exactly the same right to be there as a duchess in diamonds. And maybe for her, she did. Because that was the strangest thing about the whole collection. Elisabeth didn't seem to rank the women in it. She didn't separate the highborn from the lowborn, the respectable from the scandalous. She collected beauty the way some people collect seashells, without judgment, without hierarchy, purely for the pleasure of looking. Her sister Marie was the album's undisputed star. The former Queen of Naples, the famous heroine of Gaeta, who'd stood on the fortress ramparts during the Bourbon siege and refused to leave while the walls crumbled around her. She appeared in more portraits than any other woman in the collection. Elisabeth was her first and most generous admirer. There was no rivalry between them, no shadow of jealousy, nothing but the pure, uncomplicated pleasure of looking at a face she thought was beautiful. Marie's melancholy, her slenderness, the delicate bone structure that photography captured so much better than painting. Elisabeth loved all of it, and the album gave her a way to hold it close whenever she wished. You know what I find most interesting about this whole collection? It's not the diplomatic dispatches or the Constantinople fiasco, or even the Paris insult. It's the fact that Elisabeth, a woman who spent 3 hours every morning having her own beauty maintained, a woman who was arguably the most photographed face in Europe, a woman whose appearance was discussed and analysed and judged by everyone from scullery maids to foreign ministers, chose to spend her private hours looking at other women's faces. Not comparing, not competing, just looking. She looked at them the way she didn't want to be looked at herself, quietly, without comment, without judgment about their rank or their clothing or their morals. She looked at a circus performer from Montmartre with the same steady attention she gave to a Grand Duchess from St. Petersburg, and she placed them side by side in the same album, as if beauty were a republic where everyone held the same passport. That's an extraordinary thing for a woman of her time, her class, her position. The entire structure of the Habsburg court was built on hierarchy, who stood where, who spoke first, who entered a room before whom. And here was the Empress, in her private rooms, building a collection that treated a bareback rider as the equal of a baroness. There's a kind of loneliness in that. The loneliness of someone who lives inside her own beauty the way a prisoner lives inside a cell. Always aware of the walls, always aware of the light coming through the narrow window, always aware that the thing people value most about her is the thing she has the least control over. And then, in the quiet hours, she opens an album and looks at 100 strangers and sees in their faces something she recognises. Not vanity, not ambition, but the simple, wordless fact of being looked at. the weight of it, the strangeness of it, the way a beautiful face becomes public property the moment it's seen, and the woman behind the face becomes a little less her own. King Ludwig had collected his beauties because he desired them, or admired them, or wanted to possess some image of them for himself. His gallery was a catalogue of longing, each painting a love letter or a memory or a wish. Elisabeth's collection was different. She didn't desire these women, she didn't know them. She collected their faces the way a naturalist collects specimens, with curiosity, with care, with a taxonomist's eye for variety. Fair and dark, tall and small, aristocratic and common, clothed and barely clothed. What mattered was the face. What mattered was whatever it was that made one face stop you and another let you pass. She included Lola Montez in the album, her uncle's great scandal, the dancer who'd toppled a king. By the time the photograph was taken, Montez was no longer young, and the famous beauty that had captivated Ludwig was fading visibly in the flat light of the camera. But Elisabeth put her in anyway, as if the fact of having once been beautiful was enough, as if beauty left a residue on a face even after the face itself had changed. It was a generous inclusion, an appointed one, because it connected her collection, across the years and across the scandal, to her uncle's painted gallery at Nymphenburg. Two Wittelsbachs, uncle and niece, separated by a generation, both obsessed with the same question. What is it about a face that makes you stop? Both trying to pin down something that wouldn't hold still, that changed even as you looked at it, that lived in the looking more than in the thing itself. The album itself has survived. It sits in an archive now, 100 and some faces looking out from behind glass, their names mostly forgotten, their beauty preserved in the flat grey tones of 19th century photography. Some of them stare directly at the camera with the fixed, slightly startled expression that long exposure times demanded. Others look away, caught in profile, their features softened by the blur of movement. A few are smiling, most are not. They're just faces, ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, the way all faces are when you look at them long enough. Elisabeth stopped adding to the album sometime in the 1870s. By then she'd begun the long process of withdrawing from public life, hiding her own face behind fans and parasols and veils. The woman who'd spent years collecting other women's beauty was now erasing her own, refusing to be photographed, refusing to sit for portraits, refusing to let the world see what time was doing to the face they'd once called the most beautiful in Europe. It was as if the two impulses were connected, the desire to see and the refusal to be seen, two sides of the same preoccupation with what a face means and what it costs to have one that the world won't stop looking at. The album stayed behind, in a drawer somewhere in the Hofburg, 100 strangers' faces stacked together in the dark. Women who'd posed for a photographer in London or Berlin or Constantinople, never knowing that their portrait would end up in the private collection of an empress they'd never meet. Women whose names are mostly lost now, whose lives went on after the shutter clicked and the visiting card was printed, and the diplomatic pouch carried their face across a continent to a palace on the Danube. They didn't know they'd been collected. They didn't know they were beautiful to someone they'd never see. And somewhere in that collection, between a London countess and a Constantinople enigma, there's a photograph of a French circus rider in a spangled costume, sent as an insult by a woman who thought beauty was something you were born into and Elisabeth had merely borrowed. Elisabeth kept it anyway. She kept them all. Every face, every stranger, every small rectangle of light. There was a ceremony at the Habsburg court called the Circle, and it was, by any honest measure, one of the most tedious rituals ever devised by human beings. It worked like this. The Empress stood at one end of a long room, usually in a gown that had taken an hour to sew her into, with her hair braided and pinned and crowned, her waist laced to 50 centimetres, her feet in silk shoes she'd never wear again. Before her, in a long line that curved through the room and out the door, waited the ladies and gentlemen of Viennese high society, countesses, baronesses, ambassadors' wives, the women of the Sternkreuz order, the palace dames, all of them dressed in their own finest, all of them clutching the best pieces of the family jewels, all of them waiting for the Empress to speak to them. She was supposed to say something to each one, a few words, a polite question. How is your husband? How is your health? Are you enjoying the season? It was meant to be gracious, warm, a display of imperial attention. the empress of 60 million people bending her gaze for a moment to a single woman in a diamond tiara. But Elisabeth could barely do it. Her voice was too quiet. Her teeth were too bad. She'd open her lips just enough to murmur something that the person standing 3 feet in front of her couldn't hear, and the person would lean in, confused, and sometimes answer a question that hadn't been asked, and the whole exchange would dissolve into an awkward silence that Elisabeth made no effort to fill. Her niece, Marie Lariche, who watched more than one of these circles from a position close enough to read her aunt's face, described the expression Elisabeth wore on these occasions as cold and haughty, the look of a woman who was enduring something she found physically unpleasant. She called it the face Elisabeth put on when she was in harness, and whenever Lariche's eyes met hers across the room, a small, contemptuous twitch would cross the Empress's features, barely visible, quickly suppressed, as if the whole spectacle were a joke that only the two of them understood. I keep thinking about the women in that line. They'd spent hours getting ready. They'd chosen their dresses and their diamonds with agonising care. They'd rehearsed their curtsies, and then they stood there, one after another, listening to a whisper they couldn't understand, and went home feeling snubbed. It wasn't personal. Elisabeth didn't dislike them individually, or not most of them. She disliked the whole apparatus, the performing, the standing, the expectation that she would be charming and accessible and grateful for the opportunity to be stared at by 200 people in evening clothes. She'd written a poem about it, sharp and bitter, mocking the court ladies, fat and mostly stupid she called them, with the highest names and the lowest conversation, wearing their false saints' halos while they threw stones at everyone else. It wasn't subtle. But then, neither was the system she was trapped inside. There's a story from one of these evenings. Prince Kevenhuller recorded it in his diary, that captures the texture of it perfectly. The Emperor and Empress were speaking with a noblewoman at a formal reception. The woman attempted a curtsy, stepped on her own train, and sat down hard on the floor. Franz Josef moved to help her up. Elisabeth looked down at the woman and said with perfect composure, "Deeper, it wouldn't go." 3 words, in that barely audible voice, and the room went silent. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't quite cruelty. It was the response of a woman who'd been standing in these rooms for 20 years and couldn't find it in herself to pretend that any of it mattered. And here's the thing I want you to understand about the representation. It wasn't just boring. It was physically punishing in a way that nobody outside the court quite grasped. Consider the Corpus Christi procession in the spring of 1869. Elisabeth had been away, in Budapest as usual, and had skipped the opening of the new Vienna Opera, a building that had been designed partly in her honour, with a private salon decorated in violet silk and paintings of her beloved Lake Starnberg on the walls. The architects had delayed the opening date to wait for her. She'd agreed to attend, and then, the day before, she'd cancelled. Illness, she said. The Belgian ambassador's wife wrote to Brussels that the Viennese were furious. If the Empress didn't appear at the Corpus Christi procession the next morning, there would practically be a revolution. So she appeared. But consider what that appearance required. The procession began at 7 in the morning at St. Stephen's Cathedral. Elisabeth was living at Schönbrunn, on the outskirts of the city. The drive into town took time. The dressing and hair took 3 hours, which meant she had to wake up at roughly 3 o'clock in the morning. 3 in the morning, to spend 3 hours being braided and laced and sewn into a mauve silk gown embroidered with silver and set with diamonds, with a long train that required someone to carry it behind her, and then ride into the city in full court regalia to walk in a religious procession through the streets of Vienna while the entire population watched. The ambassador's wife described her walking through the procession like a beautiful swan gliding across water. She also noted with a touch of sympathy that the Empress was wearing a low-cut gown, that the morning air was cool, and that a light wind was blowing. 12 princesses walked behind her, all in décolleté, all with long trains. If they're not all sick by tonight, the ambassador's wife wrote, they'll be lucky. That's what being watched looked like from the inside. Not admiration. Not glory. A woman who'd been woken at 3 in the morning, sewn into a diamond-studded dress, and made to walk slowly through cold air while a city full of people stared at her, and a diplomat's wife took notes on her neckline. And the whole time, until the last moment, nobody had been sure she'd show up at all, because this beauty loved neither the sun nor the public. The avoidance became its own kind of scandal. When Elisabeth didn't appear at state functions, it wasn't just her absence that people noticed. It was all the women who were supposed to appear with her. The palace dames, the ladies-in-waiting, the noble women of the Sternkreuz order. They lived for these occasions. They'd spent weeks choosing their dresses. They'd had their own hair done, their own jewels polished, their own curtsies rehearsed. The chance to walk in the Empress's train, decked in family diamonds and sapphires, seen by the whole court and reported on in the society columns. This was why they endured the tedium of court life in the first place. It was their performance too. And when Elisabeth cancelled, with a note about a headache or a cough, or a vague unwellness that everyone knew was simply reluctance, they lost their moment. Their dresses went back in the wardrobe, their jewels went back in the safe, and they resented her for it. Deeply, bitterly, with the specific resentment of women who'd been cheated out of the only stage they were ever allowed to stand on. And then there was the other kind of watching, the intimate, invasive, daily scrutiny that happened not in public but behind the scenes. Every aspect of Elisabeth's appearance was observed, catalogued and discussed by the court ladies with a precision that bordered on surveillance. Every dress was compared to last year's. Every change in her figure was noted. Every flaw, a new wrinkle, a reddened eyelid, a dress that seemed slightly tighter than the one before, was reported, whispered about, analysed. Countess Festetics wrote in her diary about the court gossip machine with a mixture of fascination and horror. Even the smallest beauty flaw was noticed and commented on, she wrote. Every outfit, every hairstyle, every tiny error provided rich material for conversation. It was, in its way, a form of collective ownership. The court felt entitled to Elisabeth's body the way a shareholder feels entitled to a company's quarterly report. They'd invested their attention in her beauty, and they expected a return. When other beautiful women appeared at court, the watching intensified, because now there was a comparison to be made. In 1867, when Napoleon III and Empress Eugenie visited Salzburg, the entire court held its breath. Who was more beautiful, the Austrian Empress or the French one? Eugenie was 13 years older, but she had perfect features, exquisite taste, and a confidence in public that Elisabeth entirely lacked. The observers split into camps. Some said Eugenie's face was more symmetrical, others said Elisabeth was more graceful. One prince wrote that what gave Eugenie's face its particular charm was an expression of intelligence and self-assurance that one missed entirely in her eternally embarrassed neighbour. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the two empresses were getting along rather better than the gossips imagined. Count Wilczek, who'd been posted as guard outside Eugenie's rooms during an unannounced private visit from Elisabeth, opened the door to check on them and found, at the end of a long suite of empty rooms, the two most famous women in Europe standing in front of a mirror with tape measures comparing the circumference of their calves. The sight, he wrote later, was indescribable, and he would never forget it. Two empresses, alone for once, comparing legs with a tape measure. It was the one moment in the whole state visit when neither of them was performing for an audience. And even that moment was watched, recorded, and passed down as an anecdote. Elisabeth felt this. She felt it the way some people feel a change in air pressure, not as a specific complaint, but as a constant low-level oppression that never lifted. And every time she withdrew, the court's resentment grew, and the scrutiny when she did appear became sharper. It was a cycle that fed itself. The more she avoided the public gaze, the more ravenous the gaze became when it finally caught her. There's a scene from a visit to the painter Hans Mackart's studio that I find almost painfully revealing. Mackart was the most fashionable artist in Vienna at the time, and Elisabeth went to see his enormous painting of Caterina Cornaro, a Venetian queen, a woman of power and beauty, a subject that might have interested Elisabeth for obvious reasons. She arrived unannounced, as she always preferred. A student of Mackart's happened to be present and described what he saw. The Empress stood before the painting, silent, almost motionless, for a long time. She looked at it with what seemed like genuine attention. Mackart stood beside her, waiting for a comment, a word of praise, anything. But she said nothing. And Mackart, who was brilliant with a brush but hopeless in conversation, couldn't find a way to break the silence either. The two of them stood there, the most beautiful woman in Europe and the most celebrated painter in Vienna, staring at a painting of a Renaissance queen, saying nothing. Finally Elisabeth turned to him and said, "I hear you have a pair of Scottish deerhounds. May I see them?" Mackart brought the dogs out. Elisabeth, who owned magnificent deerhounds of her own, looked at them for a while. Then she thanked him and left. She didn't say a word about the painting, not one word. I don't think this was rudeness. I think it was something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of a woman who'd spent so many years being looked at that she'd lost the ability to look back. The painting was beautiful. She could see that. But the act of standing in a room, being observed by Macart and his student while she observed the painting, being expected to perform the role of cultured empress, offering gracious commentary. It was just another version of the circle, another performance, another moment in harness. So she asked about the dogs instead. The dogs didn't watch her. The dogs didn't judge. The dogs were just dogs. There's a moment near the end of this period, the late 1880s, that Festetics captured in her diary, and I think it says everything about what the watching had done to Elisabeth by then. The Empress appeared at a great court ball in the Hofburg, one of the last she would ever attend. She was in her late 40s, still slender, still tall, still with that posture that the German Emperor Wilhelm had described as not sitting, but descending, not standing, but rising. She wore a black gown. She'd been wearing black for years by then, mourning nothing specific, simply choosing darkness over display. The room was full of crystal and candlelight and diamond tiaras, of bare shoulders and imported silk, of the sounds that a Habsburg ballroom makes when it's full. The murmur of conversation in 3 languages, the clink of champagne glasses, the rustle of trains being arranged on marble floors. And Elisabeth stood in the middle of it all, as her niece, Marie Larish, remembered, not as though she were in a ballroom among people, but as though she stood alone on a rock by the sea gazing into the distance. Her beauty was still remarkable. Visitors still came away shaken by it, still wrote letters home about it. Her posture was still that of a woman who'd spent 30 years on the gymnastic rings, but there was nothing behind it, no pleasure, no engagement, no desire to be seen or to see. She was present in the room the way a painting is present on a wall, something to be looked at, something that doesn't look back. When the Queen of Romania, who wrote poetry under the name Carmen Silva, and fancied herself a kindred spirit, asked Elisabeth how it was possible that such beauty couldn't overcome her stage fright, Elisabeth corrected her quietly. It's not stage fright, it's boredom. Then she went back to her rooms and wrote poems in the style of Heinrich Heine, bitter, ironic verses about the court ladies and their diamonds and their gossip, verses nobody would read until long after she was gone. Larish told her admiringly that she looked like Titania, the fairy queen from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Elisabeth's answer came back without hesitation, flat and dry, not Titania, the seagull caught and sitting in a cage. And that was what 30 years of being watched had made her. Not a queen, not a beauty, not the dazzling creature that the diplomats and the generals and the court ladies had once written home about with trembling hands. A seagull in a cage, a wild creature that was meant to fly, held still, looked at, and slowly going quiet. Festetics, who loved her, wrote the cruelest and most perceptive thing anyone ever said about Elisabeth's beauty. It was as if a wicked fairy had appeared at her christening and turned every gift into a curse. Her beauty, her intelligence, her sensitivity, her independence, all of them real, all of them extraordinary, and every single one of them a source of suffering in a world that wanted her to be something simpler and more obedient than she was. The watching never stopped. She just stopped letting them see her, but that's for the next part of this story. Right now, the candles are still burning in the ballroom, and the woman in the black dress is standing very still, looking at something the rest of the room can't see. Sometime in the late 1880s, Elisabeth made a decision. She would never be seen again. Not the way the world had seen her before. Face forward, eyes open, the full force of that famous beauty exposed to anyone who happened to be looking. That was over. From now on, there would be a fan between her and the world. A black leather fan held up whenever she walked in public, shielding the lower half of her face from view, and a white parasol tipped forward at an angle shading whatever the fan didn't cover. Together they formed a barrier, a portable wall that she carried everywhere, in every country, in every season for the rest of her life. Christomanos, who watched her wield these instruments daily, wrote that the black fan and the white parasol had become almost physical parts of her body. Not accessories, not decorations, but extensions of her will. In her hands, he said, they weren't what they meant in other women's hands. They were shields, weapons of concealment, tools for defending the inner silence she carried with her, for refusing to submit to what she called the herd laws of developed little animals. She was quoting Heine when she said that. She was also describing her own life. She'd warned them it was coming. Years before, in a moment of unguarded honesty, she told one of her ladies-in-waiting that she might soon go everywhere veiled, so that not even her closest attendants would see her face. Perhaps later I'll always wear a veil, she'd said, and my face won't be seen by anyone around me. She said it with the matter-of-factness of someone announcing a change of schedule. And then she did it. The reason was simple, and it was physical. The beauty was going. Not quickly, not all at once, but steadily, visibly, in a way that the daily rituals could slow but couldn't stop. The years of walking for hours in sun and wind had weathered her skin. Not the gentle aging that some faces undergo, softening gradually, keeping their essential shape while the edges blur. This was harder than that. The extreme thinness she'd maintained through decades of fasting had left her face gaunt, the bones more prominent than they'd been in youth, the hollows deeper, the jaw sharper. Without the layer of fat that most women carried, every line showed, every fold cast a shadow. The skin on her cheeks and forehead had taken on the texture of leather, tanned and dried by 30 years of mountain air and sea wind and relentless outdoor walking. Lines appeared around her eyes and mouth, not the fine lines of a woman aging gracefully, but the deeper, harsher lines of a face that had been exposed to the elements for 3 decades and starved of the cushioning that might have softened the damage. Her joints ached, sciatica especially, which came and went unpredictably and sometimes kept her in bed for days, unable to walk, unable to ride, unable to do the one thing she'd always counted on to keep the darkness at bay. Nervous disturbances, vague, shifting, never quite diagnosed, made her restless and sleepless and prone to sudden outbursts of despair. She was approaching 50, and the body she'd spent her entire adult life perfecting was beginning, quietly but unmistakably, to betray her. Her response at first was to fight harder. More hours on the rings, heavier weights, stricter fasting. If the body was declining, she'd force it back into line through sheer will. But the will that had maintained a 50-centimetre waist for 3 decades wasn't enough to hold back time. The wrinkles deepened, the skin roughened, the headaches grew worse, and somewhere in the middle of this slow losing battle, Elisabeth stopped fighting and started hiding instead. And here's the cruel part, the truly cruel part, the part that makes the whole story feel like a fable with a dark ending written by the brothers Grimm. The world didn't know. The world still carried the image of the young Elisabeth in their minds. The Winterhalter portraits, the diamond stars in her hair, the famous waist, the chestnut braids falling to her heels. Those images had been reproduced and reprinted so many times, had travelled so far and so wide, that they'd become more real than the actual woman. And since she'd refused to be photographed or painted since the early 1880s, there was no new image to replace the old one. The world's memory of her was frozen at 35. The woman behind the fan was 60. Nobody knew what she looked like anymore. Not really. The Prussian ambassador reported to Berlin in 1891 about seeing the Empress, and even he, a trained observer, a man whose job was to notice things, could describe only the tall, narrow silhouette in black, the fan held firmly between her face and the world, the parasol angled to catch whatever light the fan missed. He saw a shape. He saw a posture. He didn't see a face. There's a story from her last years. The young Count Alphonse Clary, a boy of 7 or 8, was walking through a corridor in one of the imperial residences when he came face to face with a tall, thin woman in black. There were no adults nearby, and the woman, for once, didn't raise her fan. Perhaps she didn't expect to meet anyone in that corridor. Perhaps she was tired. Perhaps, for once, she simply didn't care. The boy saw her clearly, and was shocked. The face looking down at him was ancient, he thought, full of wrinkles, nothing like the beautiful Empress he'd heard about all his life. When he told his grandmother about the encounter, the old woman said solemnly, "Children, never forget this day, for you have seen the most beautiful woman in the world." And when the boy answered, "But grandmother, her face was full of wrinkles," He got a sharp slap for his trouble. I keep thinking about that boy's confusion, the gap between what he'd been told and what he'd seen. The whole court, the whole empire, still speaking about Elisabeth's beauty as if it were an eternal fact, a feature of the landscape like the Danube or the Alps, while the actual woman behind the fan was aging the way all bodies age, the way no amount of cold baths or gymnastic rings or raw veal masks can prevent. The legend and the reality had separated completely, and the fan was the line between them. There's a scene from an inn in Ischl, in the last year of Elisabeth's life, that was witnessed by the actress Rosa Albach-Retty, a woman who would later become the grandmother of Romy Schneider, the actress who'd play Elisabeth on film decades later, but who at this point was simply a young woman having lunch in a country inn. She didn't recognise the Empress at first, because nobody knew what Elisabeth looked like anymore. She saw two women at a table, one in black mourning clothes with a thick veil pushed back from her face, wearing black lace-up boots, the other younger and dressed in lighter colours. The younger woman, Countess Stary, the lady-in-waiting, stepped away for a moment, leaving Elisabeth alone at the table. And in those few seconds of solitude, thinking herself unobserved, Elisabeth did something that Albach-Retty would remember for the rest of her life. She looked around briefly, checking that no one was watching. Then she reached into her mouth with her left hand, removed her dentures, held them over the edge of the table, rinsed them quickly with a glass of water and slid them back in. The whole thing was done, the actress wrote, with such graceful nonchalance, and so astonishingly fast that she almost couldn't believe her own eyes. This was the Empress. This was the woman whose lips had once been compared to strawberries by a young emperor who couldn't stop talking about her, whose smile had made diplomats forget their prepared speeches, whose mouth had been so painful a subject that she'd spent 40 years barely opening it in public, the bad teeth that had caused her to whisper, the whisper that had caused the silence that had been mistaken for stupidity. And now, in a country inn, at 60, the teeth were gone entirely, replaced by something she could remove and rinse over a water glass while a stranger watched from across the room. There's nothing unkind in telling this. It's just what happens. It's what happens to everyone, to every body, to every face that time gets hold of. And I think Elisabeth knew that better than anyone. She'd spent her whole life watching her body with the attention of a scientist watching a long, slow experiment, tracking every change, measuring every fluctuation, recording every loss on a silver tray. She knew exactly what was happening. She knew the wrinkles were deepening. She knew the skin was thinning. She knew the chestnut hair was being maintained now by art rather than nature. And her response was not to fight harder. She'd been fighting as hard as a human being can fight for 30 years, but to disappear, to remove herself from view, to take the face the world had fallen in love with and simply withdraw it from circulation, like a coin pulled from the market. She never sat for a portrait again, never allowed a photograph. The last images we have of her are from her 30s, a woman with dark hair and steady eyes, and a waist you could span with two hands, looking at the camera with an expression that says nothing and reveals everything. After that, silence, a black fan, a white parasol, and the slow, steady retreat of a woman who'd decided that if she couldn't be what the world remembered, she'd rather not be seen at all. She wrote about it, in the Heine-inspired poetry that filled her notebooks in these years. One poem, dated from Godelot in 1886, began, "In my great loneliness I make these little songs. The heart, full of grief and sadness, presses down upon my spirit. And then, further on, I was once so young, so rich in love of life and hope. I thought nothing could match my strength. The world lay open before me." She was 49 when she wrote that. She was sitting in a hunting lodge in Hungary, alone except for her books and her dogs and the woman who braided her hair every morning. The world that had once lain open before her had narrowed to a fan's width. She'd given up on her contemporaries. She said so explicitly. She wrote her poems not for the people around her, but for what she called the souls of the future, readers who wouldn't be born until long after she was gone. She specified that her verses shouldn't be published until 1950, a date far enough in the future that everyone who might recognise themselves in the poems would be safely dead. She wanted understanding, and she knew she wouldn't get it from anyone alive. Even we today don't know her aging face. There's no image. The woman who was once the most photographed person in Europe made sure of that. She controlled her image so completely that she erased it, left the world with nothing but the young face, the Winterhalter face, the face from before, and that's the face we still see 130 years later when someone says the name Elisabeth. The young one, the beautiful one, the one who existed before the fan. Meanwhile, behind the fan, she fled. She left Austria as often and as long as she could, travelling restlessly from country to country, from yacht to train to hotel, never staying anywhere for more than a few weeks before the urge to move pushed her on again. Franz Joseph, alone in Vienna, wrote careful, gentle letters. "If you believe it's necessary for your health, I will say nothing," he told her, even though we've barely spent a few days together since spring. It was October when he wrote that. He'd been watching his wife vanish for years, first behind the fan, then behind the horizon, and he had no way to stop it and no language to describe what was happening. He just kept writing letters to wherever she was and waiting for the answers that came less and less often. In the 1890s, she spent perhaps a few weeks a year in Vienna, and even those she passed in near total seclusion at the Herme Villa, a private retreat on the outskirts of the city that the emperor had built for her in the hope it might make her stay. It didn't. She used it the way she used everything the emperor gave her, as a temporary shelter, a place to rest between flights, a quiet room to sleep in before the next morning's departure to somewhere else, anywhere else. But here's what I want to leave you with tonight. The beauty rituals didn't stop. That's the part that gets me. Even after she'd hidden her face, even after she'd withdrawn from every public role, even after she'd given up any hope of being admired or even recognised, she still got up at 5 in the morning and took a cold bath. She still spent 3 hours having her hair braided into the crown she'd worn for 30 years. She still did her gymnastics on the rings, in whatever palace or hotel or yacht she happened to be sleeping in that week. Still drank the broth and the egg whites. Still slept in the veal masks. Still had Fanny come to her room every morning with the combs and the pins and the silver tray, and still examined the tray afterward for fallen hairs, and still felt that quiet, familiar disappointment when she found them. The rituals continued in the dark behind closed doors for an audience of nobody. The woman who'd refused to be photographed still spent 6 hours a day being braided and laced and sewn and unsewn. The woman who carried a fan between herself and every living person still sat perfectly still every morning while someone else's hands moved through her hair. The woman who'd said she wanted to die in her braids still let those braids be built, strand by strand, pin by pin, every single day, as if the ritual itself were the point and always had been. And I think that's the detail that finally explains Elisabeth, or comes as close to explaining her as anything can. The beauty wasn't for the world. It hadn't been. Not for a long time, maybe not ever. The circle, the state dinners, the court balls, those were obligations, performances, things she endured because the alternative was worse, but the rituals themselves, the cold water, the comb, the rings, the braids, those were hers. They were the structure of her days, the architecture of her private hours, the one discipline she'd chosen freely and never abandoned. She'd been sewn into her dresses for an empire, but she braided her hair for herself. The fan hid her face, the parasol shaded her eyes, but behind them, every morning, in a room that might have been in Vienna or Budapest or Corfu, or a hotel in the Swiss Alps or a yacht anchored off the coast of North Africa, the same hands moved through the same hair, and the same woman sat in the same chair, and the candle burned down the way it always had, and the pins clicked into place one by one by one. She was 60 years old. The wrinkles were deep, the teeth were false, the joints ached on cold mornings. The world remembered a young woman with diamond stars in her chestnut hair, standing in a ballroom full of candlelight, and the real woman, the one behind the fan, the one rinsing her dentures over a water glass in an inn, bore almost no resemblance to that memory anymore. And still, every day, without exception, without complaint, she sat down in front of the mirror and began. That's where I'll leave her tonight. Not at the court ball, not in the procession, not in front of the diplomats or the cameras or the crowds. Here, in the quiet room, in the early dark, with the comb and the pins and the candle, doing the one thing she'd always done, the one thing that had never changed, the one thing that was hers. The fan is down, the heavy door is closed, and the quiet, patient ritual begins again. And so here we are, At the end of a long night's telling, back in the quiet room where we started, the curtains are drawn, the candle has burned low, and somewhere behind a closed door, a woman is sitting very still while someone else's hands move through her hair. She was an empress, but that isn't what this story was about. She was the most famous beauty in Europe, but that isn't quite right either. What she was, what I keep coming back to, lying here in the dark thinking about her, was a woman who built something. Not a palace or a kingdom or a political legacy. Something smaller and stranger and harder to name. A daily practice. A set of rituals so precise and so demanding that they consumed half her waking life, and she performed them every morning for 40 years, long after anyone was watching, long after the beauty they were meant to preserve had begun to fade behind a black leather fan. I think about the women who made it possible. Fanny with her combs and her tape and her quiet, stubborn power. The seamstresses on their knees, stitching the Empress into her dresses and cutting her free again at night. Ida Ferenczi, who came to her rooms every evening to unpin the braids and let the day fall away. The ladies-in-waiting who walked for miles behind her in ruined shoes trying to keep up. None of them famous. None of them remembered the way Elisabeth is remembered. But their hands were part of the ritual too. Part of the architecture of those long, quiet mornings that held one woman's life in place. And I think about you, lying wherever you are right now, in whatever kind of comfort you've found for yourself tonight. The distance between your life and hers is enormous. Centuries, continents, circumstances that couldn't be more different. But there's one thing that might feel familiar, the way a small daily ritual can hold you steady. The cup of tea before bed. The particular way you arrange your pillow. The sound you leave on in the background when the house is too quiet. We all build these structures, even if ours are simpler than hers, even if ours don't involve cognac and egg yolk and a silver tray. We build them because the days are long, and the body needs tending, and sometimes the gentlest thing you can do for yourself is the same thing you did yesterday, done the same way at the same time, without asking why. If anything from tonight's story stayed with you, a detail, a feeling, something you'd like to sit with, you're welcome to leave a few words below. I'd love to hear what caught you. There's no right answer. Just whatever's in your mind as you drift. And if these long, quiet evenings help you rest, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel. We're going to keep going. Slowly, gently, one story at a time. There are medieval kitchens still to visit, and Roman bathhouses, and the private rooms of Georgian country houses at dusk. There's always another door to step through, another candle to follow, another world to settle into when the night gets long. I'm glad you're here for this one, and I hope you'll come back for the next. For now, though, there's nothing left to do. The story's told, the pins are in place, the comb is resting on the silver tray. And wherever you are tonight, in whatever room, in whatever quiet, I hope the weight of the day has left your shoulders, and the dark feels gentle, and sleep comes to you the way it came to her. Eventually, after the braids were undone, and the candle was blown out and the long, careful work of the day was finally done. Sleep well.